30 spears with stone tips are pointed at his chest. He raises his hands, and the silver beneath his skin glows brighter. The shaman utters a single word, and the spears freeze in midair. Don Han stands on the crest of a hill, unsure of where he is. A minute ago, there was turbulence over the Indian Ocean, a flight to Nairobi, a water supply project for a Kenyan village, then a flash, then nothing. Now 2 moons hang above him. One is white like home. The second is blue, huge and low. It seems he can make out the relief on its surface. Don opens his eyes from the cold coming from within. His body seems to have forgotten how to be warm. Debris is burning out nearby. Molten metal and pieces of carbon fiber crumble to ash right before his eyes. The air devours them, and within a minute, only a scorched patch remains. Don raises his hand and freezes. A silvery glow flows beneath the skin on the back of his palm. Someone has turned on a tiny lantern right inside his veins. The glow pulses in time with his heartbeat. He clenches his fist, unclenches it. The silver doesn't fade. Dan stands up. The world around him is vast and wild. Ferns as tall as a 3-story house. Trees with trunks big enough to carve a room out of. Somewhere, far off, something huge lets out a drawn-out cry. Not a bird, much bigger than a bird. In the mud at the foot of the hill, he sees tracks. A 4-clawed paw the size of a dinner plate. Dan is an engineer. He calculates loads on beams and welds rebar frames. He's not a hunter or a soldier, but his father taught him one thing. When things go wrong, you don't panic. You assess. Resources, threats, water. And then he hears something else. A child crying. A thin, faint cry coming from the neighboring hill. Dan freezes. There are people here. That could be good, or it could be very bad. But a child is crying, and someone needs help. His father always said one thing. If you walk into a room and something is broken, you fix it. That's your job in this life. Dan heads toward the sound. He climbs over the ridge and sees a campsite. A dozen huts made of branches and animal skins. A bonfire in the center. 30 people in roughly tanned hides. Dirty faces, tangled hair. Spears with stone tips. The Stone Age, for real. The crying isn't coming from the fire. A woman is holding a boy of about 6 close to her. His right leg below the knee is swollen and glowing red. Black streaks are creeping up his thigh from the wound. Sepsis. Dan saw this in Kenya. A dirty wound, blood poisoning. Without antibiotics, the child will die. Maybe in an hour, maybe in 3. But he will die for sure. An old woman stands nearby, small and gray-haired, with eyes the color of a winter sky. She waves her hands over the leg and mutters. The shaman is treating him the only way she knows how. And you can see in her face that she knows the truth. The boy won't survive. 30 pairs of eyes turn to Dan. Spears rise. Someone lets out a sharp, guttural cry. Dan raises his hands, palms forward. The silver beneath his skin flashes. The shamaness sees it first. She stops muttering. Her eyes widen. She utters a single word, and the spears freeze. Dan begins to descend. Every step is slow and deliberate. His hands are in plain sight. He doesn't know their language or their customs. He doesn't know if he'll be stabbed for trying to approach the child. But the boy is dying, and he is the only one in this world who knows why and knows how to stop it. Dan approaches the shaman. She comes up to his chest. She points at the boy, at her own hands, back at the boy. She stares for a long time. Her gaze shifts to the silver beneath his skin. She turns to the chief. A large, broad-shouldered man, wearing a necklace of saber-toothed cat fangs. The shaman throws 3 words at him. The chief clenches his jaw. He looks at the dying boy. He looks at Dan. He nods. Dan drops to his knees beside the child. The boy is burning so hot that his skin sears Dan's fingers. The wound is deep, jagged, and full of pus, Black streaks have already reached the middle of his thigh. There is almost no time left. And this is where the strangest thing begins. Dan grabs a piece of flint from the fire and feels the stone through his fingers. Here, the grain runs lengthwise. There's a micro crack here. Strike at this angle, and a plate thinner than a razor blade will chip off. He's never worked with flint before, but his hands know what to do. One strike, precise. The plate lands in his palm with an edge sharper than any scalpel. The tribe falls silent. Their best craftsman spends half a day chipping off a decent flake. The stranger did it with a single strike. Dan puts the flint in the fire to heat it through. He gestures for fire and water together, boiling water. The shamaness is the first to understand, and two guys rush for water. Dan sends her for bitter leaves. He rubs one between his fingers. Tannins, astringent, not an antibiotic, but better than nothing. The water boils. He washes his hands with boiling water, burns himself, but doesn't stop. He takes out the red-hot flint. He opens the abscess with a single, precise cut. Thick, foul-smelling pus oozes out. He washes the wound with boiled water. More. He cauterizes the edges with the red-hot stone. The boy screams, and two men hold him down. Dan packs the wound with a paste made from bitter leaves. He ties it off with a strip of tanned leather. Tight, but not too tight. He sits down on the ground and exhales. His hands are shaking from the adrenaline. He has just performed surgery with a stone knife in a world without antiseptics, without anesthesia, without anything. And he isn't even a doctor. He's an engineer who builds buildings. The night drags on. Dan doesn't sleep. He changes the bandage every 2 hours. He boils water, rinses it, applies fresh paste. The shaman sits across from him and doesn't take her eyes off him. By dawn, the boy opens his eyes. His fever breaks. The black streaks fade. He didn't die. His mother cries and utters a single word that Dan doesn't understand. But he understands the tone. Thank you. The shaman stands up. She approaches. She kneels before him. Dan shakes his head. He grabs her by the shoulders and pulls her up. She doesn't get up. She places her hand on his chest, where the silver glows brightest. And she says 2 words. Echo translates them not with words, but with a feeling. You have come. Dan sits on the ground in a world with 2 moons, in a world where people die from dirty wounds. And he realizes this isn't a dream. He's here. He'll stay. And if he does nothing, these people will keep dying from things that in his world are treated with soap and boiled water. The chief approaches as the sun rises above the trees. He holds out a piece of dried meat. Dan chews and looks at the camp. The huts are falling apart. They get water from the river, murky and dirty. Food rots on the ground. Children run barefoot through the mud where scraps and droppings lie. Everything here is broken. Everything. And he walked into this room. 3 days have passed since that night when the boy opened his eyes. His name was Turi. Dan learned that name first. Turi meant little stone in the tribe's language. The boy hadn't gotten up yet, but the wound was healing, and the black streaks had disappeared completely. Turi's mother brought Dan food every morning, the best pieces. Dan accepted it, and each time gestured to her that the boy needed to drink boiled water. Only boiled water. She nodded. She did as he asked. Over those 3 days, Dan learned 20 words in the tribe's language. Water, fire, stone, tree, meat, hand, foot, yes, no, pain, good, bad, eat, drink, sleep, walk, do, give, take. Names. The shaman's name was Ima. She became his interpreter and shadow. She followed him everywhere. She listened to every sound he made and tried to understand. The chief's name was Thorn, a tall, silent man with the eyes of someone who had seen too many deaths. Thorn had a son, Brock. And Brock looked at Dan the way a wolf looks at a stranger who has entered its territory. Not with hatred, with calculation. Brock was the tribe's best hunter. Broad-shouldered, fast. With 3 scars on his chest from the claws of a saber-toothed cat he'd killed at 15. The whole tribe knew that story. Brock was the one who fed the people, the one the young hunters listened to. And now a stranger had appeared, whom his father fed the best meat, and whom the shaman called the Chosen One. Dan saw this tension. He had grown up in Seattle, but his father was from Busan. He knew what hierarchy was and what losing face meant. Brock wasn't an enemy. Brock was the chief's son, who felt that his position was under threat. That would have to be dealt with, but later. Right now, people were dying. Not from wounds, from water, from food, from filth. Dan spent the first day observing, just walking around the camp and watching, counting. 37 people, 18 adult men, 11 women, 8 children. Of the 11 women, 4 were pregnant. Of the 8 children, 3 were coughing, constantly. A wet, heavy cough that could mean a dozen illnesses, and all of them could be treated with one thing: clean water, proper food, basic hygiene. Dan sat by the fire that night and began drawing with a stick on the ground. Ima sat beside him. He drew a river. Then he drew a man drinking from the river. Then he drew a man lying down and clutching his stomach. Ima nodded. She knew. She saw it every season. The children drank from the river and then lay in the heat for 3 days. Some never got up. Dan drew a line from the river to the fire, from the fire to the water skin, from the water skin to the man. The man is standing. The man is healthy. Ima looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she looked up. There was something in her eyes that Dan would remember for the rest of his life. Not surprise. Pain. Pain from the realization that it could have been so simple. That the children she had buried could have lived if she had known one thing: fire and water together. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. On the 4th day, Dan decided that boiled water wasn't enough. He needed soap. He knew the recipe. Every engineer who had worked in developing countries knew the recipe. Fat and lye. Lye from ash. Fat from animal lard. It couldn't be simpler. He gathered ash from the fire, pure white ash from hardwood. He piled it into a hollow in the rock, poured boiling water over it, strained it through a bunch of grass. He got lye, cloudy and caustic. Then he gestured to Ima to bring some fat. She brought a piece of mutton fat the size of a fist. Dan melted it on a flat stone by the fire. He mixed it with the lye. He stirred it with a stick until it thickened. He left it on a stone to cool. By evening, he had a bar of coarse soap. Yellow, smelly, but soap. He called for Ima, showed it to her, wet his hands, lathered them up. He rubbed until it lathered. The lather was gray, but it was there. Then he rinsed it off. His hands were cleaner than anyone's in the history of the world. Ima took a piece. She sniffed it. She wrinkled her nose, lathered her hands. Her eyes grew huge when the lather appeared. She said something quickly. Dan didn't catch the words, but understood the meaning, what it was. Dan showed her the whole process again. Ashes, boiling water, strain, fat, mix, wait. Ima repeated every step. Her hands were old and strong, the hands of a woman who had survived 64 years in a world that killed. She made a second bar of soap herself, worse than Dan's, but soap. Dan smiled and showed her the sign she had already learned. Good. By the end of the first week, every family in the tribe had soap. Ima saw to that personally. She went from tent to tent and made people wash their hands before eating. Some listened, some didn't. An old hunter named Gort spat on the ground and said that his grandfathers didn't wash and still lived. Ima replied that his grandfathers died by 30 and that he was alive only because she had been lucky. Gort fell silent. Ima was small, but no one dared argue with her. At the same time, Dan began building. The first project was simple, a hearth, a normal hearth with a chimney. The tribe burned fires right on the ground inside their huts. Smoke filled the entire space. People coughed. Children choked. Chronic lung diseases in such conditions began by the age of 10. Dan found flat stones by the river. He brought clay from the bend in the river. He began to stack the stones. And then he hit a limit. After half an hour of work, his hands began to shake. His vision darkened. He felt the strength draining from his body, as if something were sucking him out from the inside. Dan stopped. He sat down. He caught his breath. He tried again. Same thing. 20 minutes later, he was staggering. He sat on the ground and looked at the unfinished hearth. Something was wrong. His ability helped him see the materials and work with perfect precision, but it didn't let him work alone. He called over Ima. He showed her the stones. He showed her how to stack one on top of another. He showed her the clay between the stones. Ima called over 2 women. They began stacking the stones under Dan's guidance, and the weakness vanished. Instantly, as if it had never been there. Dan stood nearby and showed them, like this with the stone, like this with the clay, smoother, tighter. His hands guided their hands, and the hearth wall grew, smooth, sturdy. 3 hours later, the chief's hut housed the first hearth, with a chimney made of stones and clay. The pipe emerged through a hole in the roof. Thorn lit a fire inside. The smoke rose upward. For the first time in these people's lives, they could breathe inside their dwelling. Thorn stood in his hut, breathing in the clean air, and his face bore the expression of a man who had witnessed a miracle. A small, everyday miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. Dan understood the rule. He couldn't build alone. His ability worked only through other people. He had to teach, show, lead. His hands were for precision and understanding the materials. But they were the ones who had to build, all together. Over the next 3 days, hearths appeared in every hut. Dan taught and the people learned, some quickly, some slowly. A young woman named Riva turned out to be the best. Her hands sensed stone almost as well as Dan's. She laid the walls straighter than the rest. Dan showed her how to check for plumb with a stone plumb line on a vein. Riva understood it the first time. By the end of the second week, 3 children had stopped coughing. They just stopped. Clean air in the huts, boiled water, washed hands. 3 things. 3 simple things that every child in Dan's world knew. And here, they changed everything. Ima came to Dan on the evening of the 10th day. She sat down beside him and was silent for a long time. Then she began to speak, slowly, using words Dan already knew and gestures for the rest. She told him about the children she had lost in her life. Not her own. All of them. The tribe's children. She spoke, and Dan counted on her fingers. 11. 11 children who had died in her arms, from illnesses that could be cured with soap and boiled water. Dan sat and listened. He couldn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He had no words. So he did something else. He took a piece of clay, kneaded it, and he sculpted a small figurine. A woman with her arms stretched out in front of her, holding something invisible. He gave the figurine to Ima, pointed at her, then at the figurine, then at his hands, then at the tribe. She is not a healer who failed to save. She is a healer who will save, from this day forward. Ima took the figurine, pressed it to her chest, and for the first time in 10 days, Dan saw her cry, quietly, soundlessly. The way people cry who are used to crying alone. Brock watched all this from the other side of the clearing, silently, with a stony face. On the 11th day, he walked up to Dan, dropped a deer carcass at his feet, and said one word. Dan already knew that word. Do it. Dan looked at the deer, then at Brock. Brock wasn't asking for help, he was issuing a challenge. Show me what you can do with this. You build walls and mold mud. I brought meat. Meat is life. What can you give me that I can't take for myself? Dan lifted the carcass, heavy, 40 kilograms. He carried it to his work spot by the river. He skinned it. His hands moved with frightening precision. Every cut was even. Every movement was economical. The hide came off in one piece without a single cut. Brock watched. His eyes widened slightly. Their best butcher worked 3 times slower and always ruined the hide. Dan cut up the carcass. He separated the meat from the bones. Then he began to prepare it. He cut long strips of meat, thin, even. He hung them over the smoke from the chief's hearth. Smoke from hardwood, slow smoking. He showed Ime and the 2 women how to rub the meat with ash and salt. Salt was in short supply, but Dan had found a salt spring at the foot of a cliff 2 hours' walk away. He sent 2 men there with baskets, and they brought back enough salt to last a month. 2 days later, the smoked meat was ready. Dan took the first piece to Brock. Brock took it. He took a bite. He chewed slowly. The meat was tough and dry, but it hadn't gone bad. Regular meat would spoil in 2 days in the heat. This could be stored for weeks, maybe months. Brock chewed and... Then he looked at Dan. Something had changed in his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but interest. He said 2 words. Dan understood. Show me more. It was the first step. By the 3rd week, the rains began. Not ordinary rains, but a wall of water that fell from the sky for 3 days without a break. The river swelled and rose 2 meters. The camp stood on a gentle slope, and the water came at night. Dan woke up to screams. Cold, dirty water was flooding the hut. He jumped outside. People were scrambling in the darkness. Women grabbed their children. Men tried to save the meat and hides. Half of it was washed away. 3 shelters collapsed. The hearths that Dan had spent 2 weeks building were flooded, and the clay between the stones had turned to mud. By morning, the tribe sat on a hill above the camp, wet, frozen, without food. Half their supply of smoked meat had been washed away. Turi sat on his mother's lap, coughing. His wound had healed, but he was weak, and the cold could kill him faster than sepsis. Dan stood on the hill and looked down. The camp lay in the mud, pitiful, defenseless. He knew this would happen. He had seen the terrain, the gentle slope, the lack of drainage, the river with its wide floodplain. A flood was only a matter of time, and that time turned out to be 3 weeks. Thorn stood beside him. His face was gray with fatigue. He looked at Dan, and there was a question in his gaze. What now? Dan pointed to the cliff, a rocky outcrop above the river a kilometer upstream. Tall, a flat summit, a water source. He had noticed it on the very first day. Back then, he thought it was a place for a fortress. But a fortress could wait. Right now, people needed shelter and dry ground. Thorn looked at the cliff. He shook his head. He said 3 words that Dan already understood. Far, hard, impossible. Dan pointed down at the flooded campsite. Then he pointed at the cliff. Then he pointed at the children. Thorn was silent. Brock approached. He had heard the conversation. He looked at the cliff, then at his father. He said 1 word. Let's go. This surprised Dan. He had expected resistance from Brock, but Brock was a hunter. He knew the terrain, and he could see that the campsite on the shore was a trap. The trek took half a day. 37 people, including 4 pregnant women and 8 children. They carried everything that was left. Hides, tools, leftovers. Dan walked ahead with Brock. They didn't talk. They couldn't. Between them, they shared maybe 30 words at most, but they walked side by side, and that meant more than words. The cliff turned out to be better than Dan had hoped. A flat summit the size of a football field. 3 sides were cliffs. The 4th was a gentle slope. The only entrance, and one that was easy to defend, Bedrock beneath a thin layer of soil. Water wouldn't flood it. A spring gushed from a crack in the rock, clear, cold. Dan stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down. The river below, the forest all around, mountains to the north. From this height, he could see 10 kilometers in every direction. His engineer's mind was already at work. Walls along the edge of the cliff. Not for defense yet, for the children's safety. Drainage ditches, sites for huts. No, not huts, houses. Real houses made of stone and clay, with birch bark roofs and hearths with chimneys. But first, a temporary shelter. Dan organized the work. He showed them how to stretch animal hides between stakes driven into the crevices. He showed them how to lay out sleeping areas of dry grass on top of the stone. He showed them how to build a fire in a wind-protected hollow. By evening, the tribe had a shelter. Rough, cold, but dry. Dan didn't sleep that night. He walked along the top of the cliff and calculated. Dimensions, angles, the journeys. His ability allowed him to hold a three-dimensional model of 50 elements in his head. He calculated the loads on the stone walls without paper or a calculator. He simply saw it in his mind. Here is the foundation. Here is the load-bearing wall. Here is the doorway. The roof pitch for water runoff. The wall thickness for insulation. The location of the hearth for maximum heat with minimum firewood consumption. By dawn, he had a plan. Not on paper, in his head. The first house. Stone walls 2 fists thick. Clay mortar between the stones. Wooden beams for the roof. 3 layers of birch bark roofing. A hearth against the far wall with a chimney. A window, 1, small, for ventilation. A door made of bound poles, 3 by 4 meters in area, enough for a family. In the morning, he gathered the people. He drew the plan on a stone with charcoal. He showed them the walls, the roof, the hearth. The people looked and didn't understand. They had lived in huts all their lives, and the lives of their ancestors. The idea of a stone house was to them what the idea of a space elevator was to Dan. Theoretically possible, but why? Ima was the first to understand. She looked at the drawing, then at the wet, frozen children, then at Dan. She nodded and began speaking to the tribe. Dan didn't know what she was saying, but 10 minutes later, 20 people were standing before him, waiting for instructions. The work took 8 days. 8 days from dawn to dusk. Dan demonstrated. The people followed. He taught them how to select stones, flat ones for the walls, long ones for the corners. He taught them to mix clay mortar, clay, water, and fine gravel. Mix until smooth. Apply in an even layer. He taught them to set wooden beams, how to cut a groove in the stone so the beam would fit snugly, how to tie the beams with ropes so the roof wouldn't slide off. Riva again proved to be the best. She laid the walls faster and more evenly than the others. Dan watched her and saw in her what he sometimes saw in the apprentices on the construction site, a natural understanding of structure, a sense of balance. Riva didn't know the word architecture, but she was an architect. Brock worked in silence. He hauled stones, the heaviest ones. The ones others carried between 2 people, he carried alone. He didn't do it to show off his strength. Dan could tell. Brock did it because that was how he understood contribution. He didn't know how to build walls, but he could carry a stone, and he did. On the 5th day, Brock approached Dan in the evening. He dropped an armful of straight, long poles made of hardwood at his feet, straight as a ruler. Dan looked at the poles, then at Brock. Brock pointed to the unfinished roof. He had cut these poles specifically, chosen the straightest trees in the forest, cut them to the same height, trimmed the branches, brought them for the roof. He didn't wait for instructions. He saw the problem and solved it his own way. Dan nodded, gave a thumbs up. Good. Brock didn't smile, but he left faster than usual. On the 8th day, the first house was ready. Stone walls, clay mortar, a wooden roof covered with 3 layers of birch bark, a hearth with a chimney, a door made of poles, a window, small, high up, so the smoke from the hearth would escape and not accumulate. Thorn went inside first. He stood in the middle of the house and looked around. Then he raised his hand and touched the wall. A stone wall, warm from the hearth, sturdy. It didn't sway in the wind. It didn't get wet in the rain. It didn't collapse under the snow. Thorn turned to Dan, and he did what a chief does only on the most important occasions. He struck his chest with his fist, once, sharply. It signified an oath, allegiance. Dan was now more than just a stranger in the tribe. He was the one the chief had struck on the chest. Dan responded with the same gesture, fist to chest, a strike. He didn't know the exact meaning, but he knew it was right. Over the next 3 weeks, the tribe built 6 houses. Not Dan, the tribe. He only showed them, taught them, corrected them. Riva led a crew of 4 women, and they laid the walls with almost no help from him. Brock organized the gathering of stone and wood. Without instructions, on his own. He saw what was needed and did it. Gort, an old hunter who used to spit on soap, was now hauling clay in bark buckets. Not because he believed Dan, because his granddaughter had stopped coughing after they moved from the hut to the stone house. By the start of the 2nd month, the camp on the cliff looked like a village. 6 stone houses, a central hearth in the clearing, drainage ditches along the edges, a palisade of poles along the cliff's edge, a spring lined with stone and clean. And people. People who washed themselves, boiled water, smoked meat, lived in dry, warm houses. The echo around the cliff grew thicker. Dan could feel it, a warm hum in the earth and in the air, as if something were satisfied, as if something was watching and approving. Ema felt it too. She would come up to Dan in the evenings and place her hand on the ground. Then she would place her hand on his chest and say one word, the same one every evening. Dan had learned it. Growing. Copper. Dan found it in the 6th week, greenish veins in a rock outcrop north of the cliff. He touched the stone and felt it. Copper ore. Not rich, maybe 3 or 4% content, but enough. He searched for tin for the next 5 days. He walked around the area. He touched the rocks. He listened to what they were saying. On the 6th day, he found it. Cassiterite. Dark, heavy grains in the river sand. A 4-hour walk to the east. Copper and tin. Bronze. The metal that changed the history of humanity on Earth. Here, it would change the history of Orna. But first, he needed a furnace. Dan knew how a primitive smelting furnace worked. He'd studied it in college in his engineering history course. A pit in the ground, clay walls, an air duct, bellows for supplying air. The melting point of copper is 1,085 degrees. A regular fire produced temperatures ranging from 600 to 800 degrees. Not enough. Forced airflow was needed. Bellows. Dan spent 2 days on the bellows. 2 wooden plates, a leather bag between them, a tube made from a hollow stalk. You press the plates, air flows through the tube into the furnace. The temperature rises. He showed the design to Brock, not because Brock was the best candidate, because Brock was the one who needed to be involved. A hunter without a hunt was bored and angry, and an angry Brock is a problem for the whole tribe. Brock looked at the bellows. He turned them over in his hands. He pressed them. Air shot forcefully out of the tube. Brock pressed them again, and again. An expression appeared on his face that Dan had seen before. On children's faces, when they figure out how a new toy works. Surprise and eager curiosity. Brock pumped the bellows for half an hour and didn't get tired. His hands were made for repetitive, heavy work. Dan showed him how to direct the air into the furnace, how to watch the color of the flame. A white flame meant it was enough. Yellow meant to pump harder. Brock nodded. The first smelting was a disaster. The temperature wasn't high enough. The ore had baked into a useless lump. Dan pulled it out of the furnace and examined it. He touched it. He felt it. The air duct was too wide. The air was dispersing before reaching the necessary pressure. He remade the tube. Now, longer, with a nozzle at the end. The second smelting went better. The copper flowed. A thin red stream gathered in the stone mold at the bottom of the furnace. A finger-sized ingot, crooked, dirty, full of bubbles, but copper. Dan picked it up and showed it to Thorn. The chief took the ingot, turned it in his hands, felt the surface. Metal, not stone, not bone, not wood. Something completely new. Thorn didn't know the word for it. His language didn't contain the concept of metal. He said 2 words. Dan translated them for himself. Hard water. Close. The copper ingot was useless without tin. Dan sent 2 men to the eastern river for cassiterite. They returned 2 days later with a sack of dark sand. Dan washed the sand. He selected the heavy grains. He mixed them with the copper ore in a 9-to-1 ratio. 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Standard bronze. The third smelting. Brock pumped the bellows steadily and powerfully. The flame was white. Dan watched the process. The ore melted. The metal flowed. And when Dan poured the molten metal into a stone mold and waited for it to cool, he held in his hands the first bronze ingot in the history of the world of Orn. Golden, heavy, durable. Dan tapped it with a stone. The ingot rang out. It didn't crack. It didn't bend. It rang out. Brock heard the sound and came over. Dan held out the ingot to him. Brock took it. He tapped it with a stone himself. A ringing sound, clear and bright. Brock looked up at Dan, and for the first time in 6 weeks, Dan saw in those eyes what he had been looking for. Not interest. Respect. Dan made a knife from the first ingot. Not by himself. He showed Brock how to heat the metal, how to strike the red-hot plate with a hammer. The hammer was made of stone, attached to a wooden handle. Primitive, but bronze is softer than iron, and yielded. Brock struck. Dan guided him, showed him the angle of the blow, the force, the frequency, how to rotate the workpiece. Brock learned quickly. His hands were precise by nature. A hunter accustomed to throwing a spear 30 paces and hitting a target the size of a fist. By evening, the knife was ready. Rough, short, with a blade the length of a palm, but made of bronze. Dan sharpened it on a flat stone. The blade became sharp. Not like flint. Flint was sharper, but bronze didn't crumble. It didn't break on impact. It could be sharpened again and again. Dan handed the knife to Brock. Brock took it and stood silently. He looked at the blade. Then he took out his old flint knife. He compared them. The flint was tied to the handle with sinew and wobbled. One awkward movement and the stone would crack. The bronze knife sat tight, solid, sturdy. Brock raised the bronze knife and struck a log. The blade went in deep. He pulled it out. He struck again. No cracks, no chips. Brock turned to the young hunters standing around watching. He raised the knife. He said something, short and sharp. The hunters murmured. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood what had happened. Brock had just shown the knife to his people. A knife he had made with his own hands. Under Dan's guidance, but with his own hands. And that was what mattered most. Dan couldn't just give Brock the knife. He had to help Brock make the knife. The difference between a gift and a skill. A gift creates a debtor. A skill creates an ally. For the next 2 weeks, Dan and Brock worked together every day. In the morning, Brock would go hunting. In the afternoon, he would come to the forge. They smelted 12 ingots of bronze. From them, Brock forged 5 knives, 3 spearheads, 2 needles. The needles were Dan's idea, but Brock made them. Thin, with an eye. The first metal needles on this planet. Dan took them to Ima. The old shaman took a needle. A thin one, shiny, with a tiny eye through which a thread could be passed. She had spent her whole life sewing with bone needles that broke after a week. This one won't break. Ima looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears. Dan was already used to this, to the tears of people who, for the first time in their lives, were receiving something that worked, that really worked. that didn't break, that didn't crumble, that didn't dull after 3 stabs. Something made for a specific person. Dan had made the eye of the needle slightly larger than standard because Emma's eyesight was failing, and it was hard for her to thread the needle through the small hole. He didn't tell her that, but she understood. She understood everything. The next project changed everything. A bow. Dan had promised Brock a bow, a real one, with the right curve, with a bowstring made of twisted sinew that wouldn't snap after 10 shots. The tribe's hunters used primitive bows, a stick with a sinew tied to it, a range of 30 paces, no accuracy whatsoever. Every third shot, the sinew snapped. Dan found the right wood, yew, or something very similar to yew. Dense, flexible, with different densities on the outer and inner sides. He cut off a piece, touched it, felt the grain. The fibers ran straight, not a single knot in 1.5 meters. Perfect. He showed Brock how to work the piece, slowly, shaving off thin layers with a bronze knife, shaping the curve. The bow's limbs must be of equal thickness, the center slightly thicker, the ends thinner. Brock worked for 3 days. His hands were patient. A hunter, accustomed to sitting in ambush for hours, did not rush. He shaved off shavings and checked the curve. Dan stood nearby and made adjustments. A little thinner here, a little thicker there. For the bowstring, Dan took deer tendons. He twisted them into 4 strands. Then he twisted the strands together. A thick, twisted bowstring, as thick as a pinky finger, strong enough to last 1,000 shots. He tied the bowstring to the bow. He pulled it taut. The bow bent evenly, both limbs equally. Dan released the bowstring. It sang, a clear, high-pitched sound. The hunters standing around fell silent. They knew that sound, but they had never heard it like this. Dan handed the bow to Brock. Brock took it. He pulled the string up to his ear. His eyes widened. The tension was even, light at the start, building toward the end, just as it should be. He took an arrow, an ordinary one, with a flint tip. He aimed at a tree at the edge of the cliff. He let go. The arrow flew, not 30 paces, 90, and it sank into the tree trunk right up to the tip. Silence. Brock stood with the bow in his hands and looked at the tree. 90 paces, 3 times farther than their best bow, and right on target. He turned to Dan, and did something Dan didn't expect. Brock struck his chest with his fist, the same gesture his father had made, an oath, loyalty. But coming from Brock, it meant more, because Brock didn't give it away easily. Dan responded in kind, fist to chest, a blow. That evening, Brock sat by the fire and showed the bow to the hunters. He explained how he'd made it, with his own hands. 3 days, every cut, every curve. Dan showed him. Brock did it, and Brock wanted every hunter to have a bow like that. He turned to Dan and said one word. More. Dan nodded. He'd make more, not just one. They would make them together. All the hunters, each his own bow, with their own hands. Because that was the only way his ability worked. And that was the only way the world was built. By the start of the 3rd month, Dan had stopped counting the days. Not because he'd gotten used to it, because there were too many days, and each one was filled from dawn to dusk. He was counting something else. People. 37 became 42. The first child was born in the stone house, a boy. The mother gave birth on clean animal skins. Emma delivered the baby with hands she had washed with soap, boiled water, clean bandages. The boy survived. The mother survived. No one was surprised. They had already grown accustomed to the fact that children didn't die in the village on the cliff. But Dan knew that this wasn't normal. It was a miracle, held together by soap and boiling water, and it could end at any moment if something went wrong. The pottery workshop became the second major project after the smithy. Dan knew that without pottery, it was impossible to store supplies, impossible to boil large quantities of water, impossible to cook properly. The tribe used leather water bags and hollowed out stones. The water bags leaked. The stones were heavy and small. They needed pots. The clay was good. Dan checked it. Dense, malleable, no large inclusions. From a bend in the river beneath the cliff. He gathered some clay and brought it to the site. Then he assembled a group. 4 women. Riva, Turi's mother named Alva, 2 others. Ima came on her own. Dan showed them. Knead the clay. Remove the pebbles. Add water if it's dry. Knead until smooth. Then shape, in rings, one on top of the other. Smooth the walls with wet fingers. Even thickness. Not too thin, it'll crack. Not too thick, it won't heat up. As thick as a finger. The first pots were ugly, crooked, thin-walled in one place and thick in another. Alva broke 2 before she got the 3rd one right. Riva made her first decent pot on her 2nd try. Dan wasn't surprised. Firing. Dan dug a pit, lined it with stones, built a fire, let it burn down to embers, placed the pots inside, covered them with coals, covered them with clay shards on top. Slow heating, even, 12 hours. He stayed up all night monitoring the temperature. He added coals. He checked the heat. By morning, he pulled out the first fired pots. 3 out of 7 had cracked. 4 had survived. Reddish, sturdy, ringing when tapped. Dan filled one with water. The pot held. Not a drop leaked out. Alva took the pot in her hands and looked at it as if she were holding a living creature. She had never seen anything like it. A thing made of mud that holds water. She set the pot on a stone by the hearth. She poured in water. She tossed in pieces of meat and roots that the women had gathered in the forest. She set it over the coals. An hour later, she had soup. The first soup in the history of this world. Hot, thick, in a vessel that didn't leak or crack from the heat. Alva called for her son. Turi came limping. His leg had healed, but the scar remained. He sat down next to his mother. She gave him soup in a small clay bowl that Dan had made especially for a child's hands. Turi drank and smiled. He was 6 years old and didn't know that a month and a half ago he was supposed to have died. Dan watched this scene, and for a moment, everything stood still. An engineer from Seattle, a boy with a bowl of soup, thousands of years of civilization between them, and it all came down to a clay pot and clean water. Sometimes that's enough. The pottery workshop was up and running. Dan had trained the women and stepped back. Riva took charge. She organized the clay extraction. She assigned shifts for firing. She instituted an inspection of the finished pots. She tapped each one and listened to the sound. A dull sound meant it was bad. A ringing sound meant it was good. Dan hadn't taught her that. She figured it out on her own. By the end of the 3rd month, every family had 3 pots. For water. For food. For storing grain. Grain. Dan found wild wheat in the valley south of the cliff. Not wheat as we know it. Something similar. A grass with heavy ears and large grains. He gathered the seeds and brought them to the settlement. He showed them to Ima. He crushed the grains between stones, got coarse flour, mixed it with water, placed the flatbread on a hot stone by the hearth. 5 minutes later, the flatbread rose and browned. Bread. Coarse. Flat. But bread. Ima tasted it. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and looked at Dan with an expression he had already learned to read. This could save them through the winter. Dan nodded. That was exactly why he had brought the grain. Meat depended on the hunt. The hunt depended on the game. The game was moving north. The drought continued. The rivers were running low. Every month, Brock returned from the hunt later and with less game. The grain was a safety net. Dan organized the planting. A small field on the southern slope beneath the cliff. Soft soil. Enough sun. He showed them how to loosen the earth with sharpened sticks, how to make furrows, how to plant the seeds at equal distances, how to water. The people looked at him skeptically. They didn't understand why they should put food in the ground when they could eat it. Dan demonstrated. 1 seed in the ground, then a sprout, then an ear of grain with 20 seeds. 1 becomes 20. Gort, the old hunter, shook his head. He said that spirits give meat, and the earth gives only dirt. Ima answered him, sharply. 3 words. Gort fell silent and picked up a hoe. Dan thought it would be good to know those 3 words. Judging by Gort's face, they were very convincing. The water supply. Dan had been thinking about it since his first day on the cliff. The spring gushed from a crack in the rock. Good, clean, but the water had to be carried from the spring to the houses in water bags and pots. The women spent 2 hours a day carrying water, 2 hours that could have been spent on something else. Dan found bamboo. Thick, hollow stalks grew in thickets at the foot of the cliff. He cut down 20 stalks. He cleaned out the pith with a long stick. He adjusted them to the right diameter, and he joined them together, the end of one into the beginning of the other. He sealed the joints with clay mixed with animal fat, watertight. The pipeline ran from the spring to the central area of the settlement. At a slight slope, gravity did the work. Water flowed through the bamboo pipes and poured into a stone basin that Riva had built in a single day. Thorn stood by the basin and watched the water flow on its own. No hands, no feet, no effort. It just flows. He turned to Dan, and in his eyes was something close to fear. Not fear of Dan, fear of the scale of what was possible. If water could flow on its own, what else could do so? Brock reacted differently. He looked at the plumbing, then at Dan, and asked a question that showed Dan he had underestimated the chief's son. Brock asked if it was possible to make the water flow upward. Dan thought for a moment. Then he smiled and began to draw on the stone with charcoal. Archimedes' screw. A spiral inside a pipe. You turn the handle. The water rises. Brock looked at the drawing, his eyebrows knitted together in concentration. He didn't understand, but he wanted to understand. And that was more important than understanding. That evening, Dan sat alone on the edge of the cliff. A rare moment of silence. The sun was setting, and the blue moon was rising above the horizon. Huge, bright. Too bright for a natural satellite. Dan looked at it and thought. His ability. Echo. Teleportation. 2 moons. A world frozen in the Stone Age on a planet where pterosaurs fly alongside mammoths. None of this was natural. Someone or something had transported him here, given him this ability, forced him to learn rather than do it himself. Why? He didn't know. But he knew the answer was somehow connected to the blue moon, with Echo, with the silvery glow beneath his skin. Ima came over and sat down beside him. She often did that. She'd come and stay silent, just sit there. Today she spoke, slowly, choosing words Dan could understand. She spoke of Echo, about how she'd felt it since childhood, how it spoke to her, not with words, with images, with sensations. She said that Echo had slept through many moons, so many, more than could be counted, and that it had awakened when Dan fell from the sky. She placed her hand on the ground. Dan felt the same thing she did, a hum, warm and deep, as if the earth itself were breathing. Ima said one more thing. She said that in the deepest caves in the north, there are walls made of black stone that cannot be broken. Walls that were not made by humans or spirits. Walls that were here before everything else. Dan listened, and his heart beat faster. Ruins. A previous civilization. The Echo wasn't natural energy. It was a legacy. Someone's legacy. But whose? And why? That was a question for later. Now he had winter on the horizon, 3 months until the first frosts, and 42 people counting on him. Dan stood up. He looked at the settlement. 6 stone houses. A smithy, a pottery workshop, a water supply, a field of grain, a smokehouse, supplies of meat and grain in clay pots. Not bad for 3 months' work. But not enough. Winter in this world was a killer. 28 years was the average life expectancy, and half of all deaths occurred in winter. Cold, hunger, disease. Dan looked at his hands. Calluses, burns from the forge, cuts from flint. The hands of an engineer who had spent 3 months building a civilization with his bare hands. A silvery glow pulsed quietly and steadily. He clenched his fists. Winter wouldn't take a single one. Not a single one. He returned to the blueprint in his mind. The walls. Strong walls around the settlement. Not for war, for warmth, for protection from the wind, so that 42 people could survive what had killed their ancestors for thousands of years. He began to count. Stones, clay, wood, working hands, time. 3 months. He'll make it. He has to make it. The walls were rising, 10 rows of stone every day. Dan divided the construction into sections and assigned teams. Riva was in charge of the south wall. Brock was in charge of the north. Gort, whom no one asked for his opinion on the mud anymore, hauled stones with 3 young hunters. Dan walked between the sections and checked. He touched the walls. He could feel where the mortar had settled unevenly, where a stone sat crooked. He corrected it. He demonstrated. The wall was not just a wall. Dan had designed it with double masonry. 2 rows of stones, with the space between them filled with dry grass and clay. Thermal insulation. The tribe didn't understand why 2 rows when 1 would suffice. Dan demonstrated. He placed his hand on the outer wall of Thorn's house. Cold. He placed his hand on the inner wall. Warm. 2 rows meant warmth. 1 row meant cold. The people understood. Work went on from dawn until noon. After noon, the hunters went out hunting. Brock led them. Now, everyone carried a bow with triple the range. 8 bows for 8 hunters. Dan and Brock had made them together in 2 weeks. Each hunter made his own bow by hand under Dan's guidance. Each one shaped the grip to fit his palm. Each one twisted the bowstring himself. And each shot 3 times farther than a month ago. Hunting had changed. Before, the tribe would drive game into a corral. 20 men would make noise and shout to drive the deer toward the hunters with spears. Dangerous, slow, often fruitless. Now Brock went out with 4 archers, quietly, at dawn. They crept within 70 paces. They shot. The deer fell before it could even realize what had happened. In a single outing, Brock brought back 2 deer, sometimes 3. There was more meat than the tribe could eat. For the first time in history. Dan expanded the smokehouse. He built a second one. He showed Alva how to cut the meat into thin strips for quick smoking, how to rub it with salt, how to store it in clay pots with tight-fitting lids. The grain went into the pots too. The field on the southern slope yielded its first harvest in 6 weeks. A small one, 2 birch bark sacks of grain. But it was a start. Dan set aside a third for planting. He ground the rest between stones and distributed it to the women for flatbread. The pots of meat and grain stood in a stone storage room that Dan had built in a crevice in the rock. A cool, dry place, perfect for storage. By the middle of the 4th month, the storage area was a quarter full. Dan did the math. 42 people. Winter lasts 4 months. He needed at least 3,000 portions of meat and the same amount of grain. He had a third of what was needed. 2 months remained. He would make it, if nothing went wrong. It went wrong on the 5th day of the 4th month. Brock returned from the hunt earlier than usual, without a kill, with a look on his face that Dan had already learned to read. Danger. Brock walked to his father. He spoke quickly and quietly. Thorn listened. His face darkened with every word. Then Thorn turned to Dan and said 3 words. Strangers. Close. Dan went with Brock. They climbed down the cliff and walked 2 hours north. Brock moved silently. Dan tried. He wasn't very good at it. An engineer isn't a hunter. But Brock didn't look back or grimace. He accepted Dan for who he was. At the edge of the forest, Brock stopped. He pointed down. A fire was burning in the valley. 10 people, no, 12, big ones, in skins with painted faces, spears longer than those of the people of Thorn. Skulls hung from 2 spears, human skulls. Dan felt a chill in his stomach. Brock whispered a single word. Grow. Dan knew that name. Ima had told him. Grow Bloodbone, a cannibal shaman from the north, the leader of a tribal confederation marching south, destroying everyone in his path. These were his scouts, 12 warriors, a 2-hour walk from the settlement. They returned in silence. Thorn gathered the council around the central fire, all the adult men, Ima, Dan. Thorn spoke. Dan didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Grow's scouts. They're looking for tribes, counting people, spotting the weak. Then they leave. Then Grow comes, with his whole horde, and after Grow, no one is left. Brock wanted to attack, to kill the scouts, all 12 of them. The young hunters backed him up. Gort shook his head. If we kill the scouts, Grok will find out. He'll send more. He'll send them faster. Thorn was silent and listened. Then he turned to Dan. The tribe was waiting. Dan thought. For a long time. The silence was oppressive. Then he began to draw on the ground. A cliff. Walls. A single path leading up. Narrow. He showed them. 12 enemies are walking along the path, one after another, because the path is narrow. At the top, 10 defenders, with bows, shooting down. The advantage of height. Not even 100 enemies would climb the cliff if the path was narrow and the defenders were shooting from above. Thorn looked at the drawing. Brock looked at the drawing. Gort looked at the drawing. They didn't fight like that. They fought face to face, wall to wall. Whoever was stronger won. The idea that a place could be a weapon was new to them. Like soap, like boiling water. New and strange. But Brock was the first to understand. He looked at the cliff, at the narrow path leading upward, at the sheer walls, and nodded, slowly. Out of respect for the idea, not the person. Dan continued drawing. Walls at the top of the cliff, higher, thicker, with platforms for archers, with a stockpile of stones at the edge that could be dropped on those climbing up, with gates on the path, wooden, heavy, that could be closed and barricaded. It wasn't a fortress. Not yet a fortress, but the first step toward one. Thorn stood up. He pounded his chest with his fist. The decision was made. We're building. We won't touch the scouts. Let them see the walls. Let them tell Groku that this isn't a soft tribe, but a place that bites back. The workload doubled. Now they built not just from dawn until noon, but all day long. The hunters went out in pairs and returned quickly. The rest hauled stones. Dan redesigned the wall plan. He added platforms. He added steps on the inside so archers could climb up and shoot from behind the wall. He added a supply of stones, round ones, heavy ones, the size of a head. That could be rolled down the path. The walls went up in 20 days. Not perfect, not even. Too thin in some places, too thick in others. But walls, as tall as a man, all around the cliff's perimeter, except for the sheer drops, with platforms for shooting, with a gate made of logs bound with sinew and fastened with bronze clamps. The first bronze clamps on the planet. Dan stood at the gate and looked down at the path. It wound its way up the cliff face in a zigzag. Anyone walking along it was visible from above throughout the entire ascent. 3 minutes of climbing under fire. Brock checked. He stepped onto the platform. He took his bow. He shot down the trail. The arrow stuck into the ground at the foot of the slope. Every point along the trail was within range. Brock turned to Dan and smiled. For the first time in 4 months, a wide one, showing his teeth, like a wolf that had found its den. On the 23rd day after the scouts were spotted, they arrived. Not 12, 30. 30 Grok warriors emerged from the forest at dawn, painted faces, spears with skulls. They marched openly. They didn't hide. They were used to being feared. They climbed to the base of the cliff and stopped. Walls, stone walls at the top, a log gate. People on the battlements, with bows. They hadn't expected this. Dan stood on the wall above the gate. Thorn was beside him. Brock was beside him, bow in hand. The leader of the Graka squad. A huge man with a necklace made of fingers. He looked up. He shouted. Dan didn't understand the words. Thorn translated with a gesture. "He wants us to come down." Dan shook his head. Thorn shouted back, short, sharp, "No." The leader stood below and looked up. He saw walls that shouldn't have been there. He saw bows that shot farther than his spears. He saw people who weren't afraid. He stood there for 10 minutes. Then he turned and led his men into the forest. 30 warriors left without starting a fight, because the place was treacherous, because climbing a narrow path under fire from the walls is suicide, and even a cannibal understands that. Dan exhaled. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the fear he'd held inside while standing on the wall. He wasn't a warrior. He was an engineer. But his walls had just done what they were built to do. They'd protected people. Thorn put his hand on Dan's shoulder. Heavy, warm. And he said one word. Dan knew it. Home. They were gone, but they would return. Dan knew it. 30 scouts would tell Grok about the walls and the bows and the cliff. Grok would not retreat. He would come himself, with hundreds. And by then the walls would have to be higher. There would have to be more bows, and Dan would have to come up with something else, something this world had never seen before. The first snow fell a week after the scouts left. Soft, light, melting on the rocks by noon. But Dan knew that after the soft would come the hard. After the light, the heavy. After the melting, the kind that wouldn't melt until spring. Winter was coming. The settlement on the cliff was ready. Almost. 8 stone houses, walls around the perimeter, a storage shed with supplies, a water pipe from the spring, a smithy with a snow shelter, a pottery workshop under a birch bark roof. A bathhouse. Dan built the bathhouse third, after the smithy and the workshop. A stone room 3 by 3 meters. A hearth with large stones. The stones heated up in 2 hours. Water poured on the stones produced steam. Ima looked at the bathhouse and shook her head. She didn't understand why anyone would sit in hot steam. Dan demonstrated. After the bathhouse, the skin is clean. Wounds heal faster. Lice and fleas die from the heat. Skin diseases go away. Ima understood. And she was the first to climb into the bathhouse. She came out half an hour later, red as a boiled crab, and said one word. More. Now the bathhouse was in use every evening. The women went first, then the men, then the children. By the end of the month, not a single louse remained in the tribe. Not a single one. People stopped scratching. Gort, who had refused to wash in hot water for 2 weeks, now went to the sauna every day and grumbled if anyone took his spot on the top bench. But the main task was heat. Dan counted the firewood supplies. 8 houses. 4 months of winter. Each hearth burned about 10 kilograms of firewood a day. 8 houses is 80 kilograms a day. 4 months is 120 days. 9,600 kilograms. Almost 10 tons of wood. Plus the smithy. Plus the bathhouse. Plus cooking. 20 tons. At a minimum. Dan organized the harvest. Every day, 4 men went down into the woods with bronze axes. 3 axes were ready by the first snow. A bronze axe chopped wood 3 times faster than a stone one. The men brought the firewood up to the cliff and stacked it against the wall. Dan showed them how to stack it so the wood would dry and not rot, in rows, with gaps for air, under a shelter. By the time the real freezing weather, the stack was 10 meters long and 2 meters high. Dan estimated by eye, 15 tons, not 20. But if we conserve, it'll be enough. He taught the people to close the doors tighter, to caulk the cracks with moss and clay, to hang a hide over the doorway. Every little thing saved heat, and therefore firewood. The frost came in the middle of the 5th month, a real pite, bitter. The water in the pool froze overnight. Dan went out at dawn and saw that the spring was freezing too. a thin crust of ice on the rocks. The stream had grown thinner. If it froze completely, the village would be left without water. He dismantled the bamboo water pipe. The bamboo cracked in the frost. Instead, he carved a channel in the rock, a shallow one, a narrow one. He covered it with stone slabs so the water inside wouldn't freeze from the wind. The spring gushed from deep within the rock, and the water was warm. If he shielded the channel from the wind, it would reach the basin without freezing. It worked. Water flowed. In a thin stream, but it flowed. Dan covered the basin with a wooden lid. To open it, he had to lift the lid, scoop up some water, and close it again. It was inconvenient. But the water didn't freeze. The first week of frost was hard. People weren't used to staying indoors. They'd been on the move their whole lives. They hunted, they gathered, they walked. And now, just walls, a house, a hearth. And that was it. The children were acting up. The adults were angry. Brock paced around the settlement like a caged wolf. He needed to do something. Dan gave him a job. Arrows. The settlement needed a supply of arrows. Lots of arrows. If Grok came in the spring, every archer would need at least 50 arrows. 8 archers meant 400 arrows, plus a reserve, 500. Brock got to work. He sat in the smithy, whittling arrow shafts, straightening them, checking the balance, attaching bronze arrowheads he'd forged himself, feather fletching. Every arrow was the same in weight and length. Dan showed him how to check the balance. Place the arrow on your finger. The balance point should be 1/3 of the way from the tip. If it's farther, the arrow will dive. If it's closer, it will tail up. Brock checked each one. By the end of the second week, he had 80 arrows. Straight. Identical. Deadly. Meanwhile, Dan turned his attention to something else. Clothing. The tribe wore hides, roughly tanned, sewn together with bone needles. The seams were coming apart. The hides let the wind through. The fur was coming loose. People were freezing. The bronze needles Brock had made changed everything. Thinner, stronger, with an eye through which a thin thread passed. Dan showed Ima and the 3 women how to sew more tightly. Double stitching, stitches every 3 millimeters. He knew this from his father. His father mended everything, including the old leather jacket he'd brought back from Busan and hadn't thrown away in 30 years. Double stitching, Dad used to say, is forever. Ima sewed. Alva sewed. Riva sewed when she wasn't working on the construction. By the end of the 3rd week, everyone in the settlement had a fur jacket with a double stitch. Thick, warm, windproof. Lena. Dan noticed her in the 2nd week of winter. A 17-year-old red-haired girl with a burned left hand. Ima's student. She sat in the corner of the shaman's house and watched. She always watched. Everything Dan did, everything he said. She didn't come over. She was shy. Her left arm was hidden under a fur. Always. Even in the bathhouse, she turned so that no one could see the scars. Dan noticed something else. Lena heard everything, every word, every inflection. When Dan said something to Ima in the tribe's broken language and mixed up his words, Lena quietly corrected him, in a whisper, so that no one would hear. But Dan heard. And another thing, Lena remembered everything. Dan once showed Ima a recipe for a wall mixture. Clay, water, gravel, proportions. A week later, he forgot the proportions and asked Ima. Ima had forgotten too. Lena spoke quietly from the corner. 3 handfuls of clay, 1 handful of gravel, water until it's as thick as honey. Exactly, word for word. Dan looked at her. She turned away, hid her hand. He walked over, sat down next to her. She tensed up like a little animal, ready to run away. Dan didn't mention the hand. He took out a stick, drew a line on the floor with charcoal, then a second one. Then he pointed to his fingers. 1 and 1 is 2. Lena looked at the drawing, then at Dan. Then she drew 3 lines next to it. 2 and 1 is 3. Dan smiled. He was drawing numbers. She memorized them on the first try, every single one, without mistakes. He drew letters, simple symbols for sounds. 1 symbol, 1 sound. Lena watched and repeated with the stick, perfectly, on the first try. By evening, she knew 10 numbers and 15 letters. By the end of the week, she could write down any word in the tribe's language. Dan gave her a thin birch bark plate and a charred stick for writing. She wrote. For hours. She wrote everything down. Ima's words, Dan's recipes, the names of herbs, the proportions of the solution, the number of arrows in stock. She became the village's memory, a living repository of knowledge. Dan made a glove for her, out of soft tanned leather, with a loop on the thumb and index finger into which the writing stick was inserted, so that her burned hand wouldn't get in the way of writing, so that her fingers, which bent poorly, could hold the tool. Lena put on the glove. She inserted the stick. She wrote the first word. Steady. Clear. Without a tremor. She looked up. Tears welled in her eyes. Dan said one phrase to her, in the tribe's language. He had been preparing that phrase for 3 days. He'd chosen the words, checked them with Ima. He said her hands were the most precious in this world, because they remember what everyone else will forget. Lena closed her eyes. Tears streamed down. She cried silently. Like Ima. Like everyone in this world who's grown used to crying so no one sees. Dan placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, like a father. Which he wasn't, but which this world forced him to be. Winter was bearing down. The temperature dropped every week. By the middle of the second month of frost, the snow was knee-deep. The trees creaked in the cold. At night, the sky was so clear that the stars seemed sharp. A blue moon hung over the horizon, huge and bright. Dan looked at it every evening, and every evening felt the same thing. It was looking back at him. The village was alive. Fires were burning. There was food. Water was flowing. The children weren't sick. The adults weren't cold. The walls kept out the wind. The roofs held back the snow. Ima came to him in the middle of winter and said that in the 30 winters she could remember, not a single one had passed without deaths. Not a single one. But this one is passing. And the reason sits next to her, drawing with a stick on birch bark. At the end of the second month of winter, strangers arrived. Not Groka warriors, others. A family. A man, a woman, 3 children, the youngest in his mother's arms. They stood at the foot of the cliff at dawn, in tattered furs, barefoot, blue with cold. The sentry on the wall raised the alarm. Brock was at the gate a minute later, bow in hand. Dan walked over and looked down. 5 of them, exhausted, starving. The child in his mother's arms wasn't moving. Dan turned to Thorn. The chieftain stood by the wall and looked down. His face was stony. In this world, strangers were a threat, extra mouths to feed, potential spies. Every tribe guarded its territory, and outsiders were killed or driven away. Dan pointed down. Children. Thorn clenched his jaw. Ima approached. She looked and said 3 words to the chief, in the same tone she used to make Gort wash. Thorn looked at her, then at Dan, then at the children below. He nodded. They were let in. The man was a hunter from the Dry Creek tribe. His name was Ven. His tribe had been wiped out by Graka's people a month ago. He had fled with his family. They were heading south, without food, without shelter. The child in the woman's arms was sick, a fever, a cough. Ima took the child right away. She washed him. She examined him. She prepared a hot herbal decoction. She poured it into the child's mouth. She wrapped him in a warm pelt. She laid him by the hearth. She did everything Dan had taught her. Boiled water, clean hands, warmth, peace. And she did it all on her own, without instructions, without help. Dan stood to the side and watched. Ima was a doctor, Orna's first doctor. She didn't know that word yet, but that's what she was. The child survived. After 3 days, his fever broke. A week later, he was sitting with the other children by the hearth, eating soup from a clay bowl. Ven looked at the village and couldn't speak. Literally. For the first 2 days, he was silent. He walked among the stone houses. He touched the walls. He looked at the water pipes. at the food storage shed, at the blacksmith shop, at the clay pots. He had come from a world where people lived in pits covered with branches, where water was taken from a stream, where food was only what you killed that day. And he saw a town. Tiny. Primitive by Dan's standards, but a town. On the third day, Ven approached Dan. He stood before him and struck his chest with his fist. Then he dropped to his knees. Dan lifted him up, by the hands, like he did with Emu on the first day. No need. Not on your knees. Never. Ven turned out to be a good worker. Quiet, diligent, strong. He hauled stones and chopped wood and did everything he was asked to do. His wife, Ula, joined Alva in the pottery workshop. Their eldest daughter, 12 years old, began studying with Lena. Letters and numbers. 2 weeks after Ven, more arrived. 7 of them. A remnant of another tribe crushed by Grok. Then 4 more. Then 10. Refugees. Grok swept through the northern lands, driving people before him like fire drives beasts. Those who fled headed quickly south and found the cliff, stone walls, smoke from the forge, the smell of food. By the end of winter, 78 people lived in the settlement, almost twice as many as at the beginning. Dan counted the supplies. There was enough food, just enough, but there was enough. Smoked meat, grain, roots that the women had dried in the fall. 42 people could survive on these supplies for 4 months. 78 could survive 2.5. Winter lasted 4. They needed more food. Brock stepped up the hunting. Now he had 12 archers, 4 new ones from among the refugees. Dan gave them bows. Not himself. The newcomers made the bows under Brock's guidance. Brock taught them, just as Dan had taught him. A chain. Knowledge passed from person to person. Dan watched and felt the echo humming louder. It approved. He liked it when people taught people. By the 3rd month of winter, Dan solved the food problem in a different way. Fish. The river beneath the cliff hadn't frozen completely. The current was fast. Open water remained beneath the ice near the banks. Dan saw fish. Large ones. Similar to trout, but bigger. About 2 kilograms each. The tribe didn't catch fish. They were hunters. Meat. Only meat. Fish was food for the weak. That's what Gort said. Dan didn't argue. He wove a net from sinew. He showed Ven how to set it between the rocks in the shallows. Ven set it. In the morning, there were 8 fish in the net. Dan gutted one and roasted it on a rock by the fire. The meat was white and tender. He let Gort try some. Gort chewed. He was silent. Then he took a second fish and began to gut it himself. A week later, 4 nets were set in the river, and every morning they yielded 20 to 30 fish. Alva smoked the fish like meat. The pots in the storeroom filled up. The food crisis was resolved. But there was another crisis, a quiet one, an invisible one. Among the refugees from the Dry Creek tribe was a man named Cost, short, wiry, with quick eyes. He didn't work. He didn't study. He sat in the house assigned to him and watched. The walls, the warehouse, the smithy, Dan. Dan noticed his gaze in the 2nd week, appraising, not hostile, worse, calculating. Ima noticed it too. She approached Dan in the evening and said one word, careful. Dan nodded. He watched Cost. He was talking to the newcomers, quietly, away from the others. Not with Thorne's people, only with the newcomers. Dan didn't know what Cost was saying, but he saw how, after his conversations, people looked at the food warehouse a little longer than necessary, and at Dan a little colder than yesterday. Brock saw it too. He approached Dan at night. He said, using a mix of words and gestures, "Cost is bad. Cost tells people bad things. We have to kill him." Dan shook his head. No, don't kill him, he thought. He'd seen this on construction sites in Kenya and Bangladesh. People who don't work but stir up discontent. They're dangerous, not by force, but by words. You can't kill them. A dead martyr is more dangerous than a living troublemaker. You have to deprive them of their audience. In the morning, Dan went to the new people, to the ones Cost had been talking to. He brought tools, bronze knives, needles. He showed them, he taught them, he worked alongside them, not like a commander, like a man who does the same thing they do. He carved spoons out of wood together with a man from the broken tribe. Spoons, simple wooden spoons. The tribe had eaten with their hands, their whole lives, always. Dan showed them how to carve a spoon from a piece of wood. A hollow, a handle, smooth edges. The man made his first spoon and ate with it that evening. Soup from a cup with a spoon. He laughed. His wife laughed. Their children laughed. Coast sat in the corner and watched. His audience was shrinking. Not because Dan said anything bad about Coast, because Dan gave people things. Not gifts, skills, spoons, warm stitches, the knowledge that water must boil. Little things that made life better. Coast couldn't compete with that. A week later, Coast left, at night, quietly, alone. He took a knife and a piece of meat from the storeroom. The sentry saw him, but didn't stop him. In the morning, Thorn asked Dan what to do. Dan said, "Nothing. He's gone. Let him go." Ima shook her head. She said Coast would go to Groch. He'd tell him about the settlement, about the walls, about the supplies, about the number of people. Dan nodded. He knew, and that meant there was less time. Grow wouldn't just come with a horde. He'd come knowing what was inside the walls, knowing the weak spots, knowing how much food and how many archers there were. Dan sat by the hearth at night and drew on birch bark by the light of the fire. Lena sat beside him and wrote down every one of his calculations. Walls, towers, traps, catapults. He had maybe 6 months, maybe less, and 78 people who needed to survive. Winter ended just as it had begun, slowly and without warning. The snow melted, streams ran down the cliff slopes. The rocks swelled and rumbled. The air grew milder. The first green shoots broke through the earth on the southern slope, and no one died. 78 people went into winter. 79 came out. One was born in January, a girl, the daughter of Vina and Ula, the first child born under a stone roof with a hearth and clean water. Ima delivered the baby, without complications. The girl was named with a word that in the tribe's language meant first light. Dan stood on the wall one morning when the snow began to melt and looked out at the world. A green valley beneath the cliff, the river, the forest, the mountains to the north, their peaks still white, and the settlement behind him. 9 houses, the smithy, the workshop, the bathhouse, the storeroom, the walls. People. Alive. Everyone. Ima came over and stood beside him, small, up to his chest. She was silent. Then she rested her head on his shoulder, gently, like a mother who is tired but doesn't want to show it. And she said in the broken language she had been learning all winter from Dan through Lena, "My son, thank you for my grandchildren." Dan stood on the wall in a world with 2 moons. The old woman pressed herself against his shoulder. Beyond the wall, the world that wanted to kill them was waking up. And for the first time since the transfer, he let himself cry. Quietly, soundlessly, like everything in this world. Tears flowed, and he didn't wipe them away. The tribe watched. From their homes, from the courtyard, they saw their spirit from the stars weeping on the wall beside the shaman, and they understood what Dan could not put into words. He is not a god, not a spirit, not the chosen one. He is just a man who is very tired and very lonely. And they loved him for that, more than for the walls and the soap and the bronze. Spring brought work, lots of work. Dan made a list in his head and dictated it to Lena. She wrote it down on birch bark. Walls taller and thicker, towers along the glam, a supply of arrows up to 1,000, new houses for the growing population, expanding the field, a second field, the wheel, the plow, a road from the cliff to the river, a bridge over the stream, a school. He paused on the last word. School. Lena wrote it down and looked at him. She didn't know that word. Dan explained with gestures. A place where children learn letters, numbers, knowledge. Lena looked at her glove with the writing stick, then at Dan, and nodded. She understood more than he had said. She would teach. But first, the wheel. Dan had been thinking about the wheel since day one. A round thing that rolls. The simplest invention that changed everything on Earth. It didn't exist here. People carried everything on their backs. Stones, firewood, water, clay. Every kilogram on their own backs. A waste of energy. A waste of time. A loss of people who strained their backs and dropped out. Dan cut a piece of log. Thick, straight. He laid it on the ground. He touched it. He felt the grain. The growth rings ran concentric and even. Good wood. He took a bronze axe and began to hew. A circle, smooth, as thick as a palm, 1/2 meter in diameter. Then a second one just like it. Then an axle. A straight stick of hardwood, thick, sturdy. He inserted the axle into the holes at the centers of the 2 circles. A pair of wheels. Primitive, rough, but it worked. He placed a frame made of poles on top, tied it down. It turned into a cart, a simple 2-wheeled cart. Dan placed a stone on it, 30 kilograms. He pushed. The cart rolled away, easily. On level ground, 1 man could haul what 3 men used to carry. Thorn stood and watched. His mouth was slightly open. A wheel, a round thing that rolls and carries heavy loads. He had never seen anything like it. No one on this planet had. Brock walked over. He looked at the cart. He pushed it himself. It rolled away. He stopped it. He pushed it in the other direction. Stopped it. Then he loaded more stones onto it. He pushed. Heavier, but still easier than carrying. He turned to Dan, his eyes burning. Just look at what we can do. Dan held up 10 fingers. Brock nodded. A week later, the settlement had 3 carts. Stone harvesting tripled in speed. Firewood gathering quadrupled. Transporting clay from the river became a 1-man job instead of 4. The walls went up faster. New houses were built faster. The fields expanded faster. The wheel changed everything, just as Dan had known. The plow was the logical next step. The sharpened stick used to loosen the soil was primitive and slow. Dan made a better one, a bronze tip on a wooden frame. 2 men pull, 1 steers. The plowshare cuts the earth into a straight furrow, deep, even. The field that 10 people had spent a week loosening with sticks was now plowed by 3 in 2 days. Dan sowed a second field, twice the size of the first. There was little grain. He used his entire supply. A risk. If the crop failed, there would be no grain until the next season. But if it survived, there would be enough to feed 100 people. People came, every week, in pairs, 5s at a time. Families, lone hunters, women with children. Rumors of the settlement on the cliff spread through the region like ripples on water. A place where children don't die. A place with stone walls and water that flows on its own. A place with metal that doesn't break. By the start of summer, the population had reached 120 people. Dan was building. Not alone, with people. New houses, extending the walls. A second smithy. Riva now led a construction crew of 10 and didn't need Dan's instructions. She designed simple things herself. A grain storage shed, a canopy for the smithy, steps on the wall. Dan looked at her and saw an architect. She didn't know that word, but that's what she was. At the end of the 3rd month of spring, Dan sent Brock out on a reconnaissance mission. Brock took 4 archers and headed north. He returned 5 days later. His face was gray. His eyes were heavy. He sat down by the fire and spoke, slowly, choosing his words so Dan would understand. Grow was gathering an army. Not squads, an army. Tribes from the north were joining him, not voluntarily. Grok came and gave them a choice. Go with him or be eaten. Most went. Brock saw the camp, from afar, from a hill. Campfires, hundreds of campfires. He counted. Stopped counting at 300. 300 warriors, maybe more. And they were heading south. Dan listened. 300. He had 20 archers, 30 men capable of wielding weapons, walls, a cliff, the advantage of height, but 300. He needed time, and he needed something this world had never seen before. Dan hadn't slept for 2 days after Brock's return. He sat by the hearth, sketching on birch bark by the light of the fire. Lina sat beside him and took notes. A catapult. Dan knew the principle. A lever, a counterweight, a sling. The energy of a falling load is converted into the energy of the throw. A medieval trebuchet could hurl stones weighing 100 kilograms a distance of 300 meters. Dan didn't need a trebuchet. He needed something simpler, smaller, faster to build. He designed a torsion catapult, 2 vertical posts, a twisted bundle of sinew between them. A lever is inserted into the bundle. You pull the lever back. The tendons twist tighter. You place a stone in the sling at the end of the lever. You let go. The tendons unwind. The lever shoots forward. The stone flies. The range depended on the thickness of the bundle and the length of the lever. Dan did the math in his head. A 2-meter-long lever. A bundle of 40 bull tendons twisted together. A fist-sized stone. A range of 150 paces. Enough to strike the path leading to the cliff long before the enemies entered the bow's range. He began to build. Not alone, with Brock and 6 men. Posts of hardwood, a frame, an axle, a lever. The tendons were the hardest part. They needed a lot, a whole lot. Brock organized the supply. Every deer they killed was now butchered with special care. The tendons were removed whole, dried, twisted. Dan showed them how to twist a tight bundle. Even tension. Uniform thickness, the entire length. Any unevenness and the catapult would fire crookedly or break. The first prototype was ready in 10 days. Small, a test model, with a 1-meter lever. Dan mounted it on the wall above the gate. He placed a stone the size of an apple, pulled back the lever, secured it with a pin. He called for Thorn. The chief stood nearby and watched. He didn't understand what he was seeing. A wooden structure, a stick, ropes, a stone. Dan pulled out the pin. The lever swung forward. The stone flew out. A whistle, a thud. The stone slammed into a tree 80 paces from the wall. The trunk cracked. Thorn stood motionless. His eyes were huge. He saw the stone fly a distance that a spear could never cover, and struck with a force that broke the tree. No hand, no man. The machine had thrown the stone. Thorn turned to Dan. In his eyes was what Dan had seen on the first day, when the shamaness had dropped to her knees. Awe, fear, and hope, all at once. Dan built a full-scale catapult over the next 2 weeks, a 2-meter lever, a bundle of 40 wires, a frame reinforced with bronze brackets. The first volley from the full-scale machine sent a 3-kilogram stone 140 paces. The stone sank into the ground to the depth of a palm. Dan imagined that instead of the ground, there was a person there. He felt sick. He sat down on the ground and breathed steadily. He was an engineer. He built houses and water pipes and schools. He had never built a weapon. And here he was, sitting in the Stone Age, building a machine to kill people. Because 300 cannibals were coming here to eat his people. His people. When he started thinking of them that way, Ima came over. She saw the look on his face. She sat down next to him and took his hand. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, as always. 5 minutes later, Dan stood up and went to build a second catapult. 2 catapults, 10 archers on the walls, 20 men with spears at the gates, a supply of stones, a supply of arrows, traps. Dan started thinking about traps. The path to the cliff zigzagged up the slope. Every turn was a spot where he could slow down the attackers. Pits. Not deep. Knee-deep. With sharpened stakes at the bottom. Covered with branches and earth. Invisible. A man steps forward. His foot sinks in. A stake pierces his soul. The warrior is out of the fight. Dan showed Brock how to dig, how to sharpen the stakes, how to camouflage them. Brock worked in silence. His face was focused and calm. He wasn't afraid of war. He was afraid of losing. In 3 weeks, the trail had turned into a death strip. 12 pits at every turn. Rocks piled at the edge of the cliff, ready to roll down at a signal. Logs suspended by vines that could be cut, sending the log rolling across the trail, knocking down everyone in its path. Dan wasn't inventing anything new. It was all in the textbooks on the history of fortification. People had learned to kill one another long before gunpowder. He simply brought that knowledge to a place where it didn't yet exist. And every time he checked a trap or adjusted a catapult, his hands trembled. Not from skill, from the realization of what he was doing. Alongside the preparations for war, life went on. Riva finished building 3 new houses. Alva was producing 10 pots a week. The fields were turning green. The first harvest from the second field promised to be bountiful. Lena was teaching the children, 7 of them, aged 5 to 12. They sat before her on the rocks and drew letters on pieces of birch bark. Lena wasn't shy in front of the children. Her gloved hand, holding a stick, moved with confidence. She demonstrated. They repeated. School. Orna's first school. Without walls or a roof, just stones and the sky and a girl with a burned hand who taught others what she herself knew. Dan watched her from afar and felt that building catapults was worth it for this. At the end of the 4th month after winter, Kira arrived, not alone, with a detachment of 5 warriors and gifts. Hides, dried meat, a sack of salt. The daughter of the Black Lake tribe's chief. Tall, dark-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being looked at. She walked ahead, her face stony. Thorn went out to meet her at the gate. They spoke for a long time. Dan stood on the wall and listened. He didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. Kira's father was proposing an alliance against Grokka, the Black Lake tribe, 40 warriors. The condition? Kira stays here, as a gift, as a pledge of the alliance, as a wife for the chieftain or his chosen one. Thorn turned and looked at Dan. Kira followed his gaze. Her eyes found Dan on the wall. And in those eyes was fury. Not fear, not submission. The fury of a cornered beast that had been sold out yet again. Thorn brought her to the settlement, showed her the house he'd set aside for her, left her there. That evening, Dan went to her. He knocked on the doorframe. Silence. He entered. Kira was standing against the wall, a knife in her hand, a bronze one of the ones Brock had made for guests. She raised the knife to Dan's throat. Her hand didn't tremble. Dan stopped. He looked at the knife, then at her. He spoke slowly, in the language of the tribe he'd been learning for 5 months, awkwardly, with mistakes, but clearly. He said that if she wanted to leave, she should go. He would tell her father that she had stayed. He didn't hold people back. Kira stood with the knife at his throat. Her eyes were shining, not from tears, from anger. She asked, "Why?" Dan said, "Because you're not a thing." She was silent. The knife didn't move. Then she lowered it, slowly. She laid it on the stone. She sat down on the floor. She covered her face with her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there. Dan sat down across from her, far away, so as not to overwhelm her, and he began to tell her, in broken language, about the walls, about the smithy, about the pots, about the wheel, about how people here don't die in the winter, about how here a girl with a burned hand teaches children to write, about how a 64-year-old shaman became a doctor, about how a hunter who used to spit on soap now goes to the bathhouse every day. Kira listened. Her hands dropped. She looked at him, and for the first time all evening, there was no anger in her eyes. Curiosity. She asked, "What are you building?" Dan answered, "Everything." Kira didn't leave. And she didn't stay as a guest. On the second morning, she left the house and walked to the wall. She touched the stones. She looked at the masonry. She walked around the entire perimeter. Then she came to Dan and said one word: crooked. Dan looked at her, then at the wall. She was right. The northern section, built by the refugee newcomers, was crooked. The stones sat unevenly. The mortar lay in clumps. The wall would withstand the wind, but not a battering ram. Dan knew that. He'd been planning to redo it, but hadn't gotten around to it. Kira asked, "Can I?" Dan nodded. She took apart the top 3 rows, by herself, without instructions. She laid the stones again, more evenly, tighter. A thin layer of mortar, evenly. Dan walked over. He touched the wall. He felt it. Good. No, not good. Excellent. She hadn't learned from him. She'd seen the walls twice, and she'd grasped the principle. She hadn't copied. She'd understood. Riva was a good builder. Kira was different. Kira saw the structure as a whole, not stone by stone, but the entire wall at once. Where it was weak, where it was too thick, where a stone could be removed and nothing would change, where one needed to add and the wall would become twice as strong. Dan showed her a sketch of the fortress, on birch bark, in charcoal, a bird's eye view, walls, towers, gates, the inner courtyard. Kira looked at it for a long time. Then she took a stick and made some adjustments. She moved the eastern tower 3 paces closer to the cliff. She removed 1 turn in the inner corridor. She added a ledge above the gates. Dan watched her make the changes and felt a chill run down his spine. Every change was right. The eastern tower closer to the cliff provided a better view. A straight corridor instead of a turn sped up the movement of defenders. The ledge above the gates allowed boiling water to be poured on the attackers. She didn't know the words for it, but she saw. She saw the way Dan saw materials, completely, through and through. Dan said one word to her: architect. She didn't understand. He explained, a person who sees a building before it is built. Kira looked at the blueprint, then at the cliff, then at her hands. Hands that had held only a knife and a spear her whole life, because in her tribe, a woman was a commodity, not a builder. She clenched her fists and said, "Show me everything." Dan showed her, for 3 weeks, every day. How to calculate the load on a wall. How to determine the angle of stability. How to choose stone for the foundation and stone for the upper rows. How to build an arch over a doorway. How to create drainage in the foundation. Kira absorbed it all. She didn't memorize, she absorbed. Like dry earth absorbs water, greedily and completely. After 3 weeks, she redesigned the gate, by herself, without Dan. The old gate was made of wood, logs bound with sinew, sturdy but vulnerable to fire. Kira proposed a stone arch with wooden doors inside and a stone canopy on top. If an enemy set the wood on fire, the stone would remain. The doors could be replaced. The arch would stand. Dan looked at her drawing. He added one detail: bronze hinges for the doors. Kira nodded, and for the first time, she smiled. Not at him, at the drawing. She was smiling at her work. It took 12 days to build the new gate. Kira was in charge. 20 people worked under her supervision. She spoke little. She showed them. She placed a stone in position, and the men saw where to place the next one. Riva worked beside her. 2 women, 2 builders. Riva was quick and precise. Kira was slow and flawless. They weren't friends, not yet anyway, but they respected each other. You could tell by the way they looked at each other's work, without words, with understanding. The gate was finished by the middle of the 6th month. A stone arch, oak log doors on bronze hinges, a canopy with arrow slits, a platform for archers on top. Beautiful. Dan hadn't expected a defensive structure to be beautiful, but Kira made it beautiful. Every stone in place, every line straight. The arch curved smoothly and precisely. It wasn't just a gate, it was a statement. People lived here who built not only to survive, but to create something greater. Dan stood before the gate and looked. Kira stood beside him, silently. She wasn't waiting for praise. She was waiting for an assessment. Dan said, "Every stone in this gate is yours." Kira looked at the gate. At the stones she had chosen, placed, and adjusted for 3 days straight without sleep. Her face changed. Not a smile, something deeper. A person who, for the first time in her life, sees her reflection not in water, but in stone. She built this. She. Not a gift, not a favor, not a pledge of alliance. Her gate, her stones, her work. Dan saw that moment and knew it was worth going through everything for it. The transfer, the loneliness, the fear, the war that was approaching. For the moment when a person realizes they can create. Between building and preparing for war, Dan didn't forget that the world around him was bigger than the cliff. Neighboring tribes came to trade. At first timidly, then more boldly. They brought hides and meat and salt. They asked for bronze knives and needles and arrowheads. Dan didn't sell. He traded. But the main commodity wasn't things, it was knowledge. Dan showed every trader. Soap, boiled water, smoking meat. Take it, for free. Make it yourselves. Some looked at him like he was crazy. Knowledge isn't given away. Knowledge is power. Why give power to strangers? Dan replied. Because if your children stop dying from dirty water, you'll come to trade again, and you'll bring more. A living trading partner is better than a dead one. Thorn didn't approve. He grew up in a world where every advantage must be guarded like teeth. Giving away the secret of bronze means losing the only thing that makes you stronger than your neighbors, Dan argued. For the first time, he argued with the chief, through Ima, for a long time. It's hard, he explained. Bronze isn't an advantage. Bronze is a foundation. If the neighbors get bronze, they won't attack. They'll be busy, building, hunting, living. And if Grow comes, the neighbors with bronze spears will stand by our side. Not because Dan bought them off, because Grow threatens them too. Thorn listened. He thought. He was silent for 3 days. Then he nodded. Reluctantly, but he nodded. Dan sent delegations to the 2 nearest tribes, with gifts, bronze knives, soap, grain seeds, and an invitation. Come, learn, build. When Groch comes, we will stand together, or die one by one. The first tribe arrived a week later, the chief with 10 warriors. They looked at the settlement, at the walls, at the smithy, at the children drawing letters on birch bark. The chief looked for a long time. Then he punched Thorna in the chest. Alliance. The second tribe arrived 2 weeks later. The third sent a messenger. The fourth came on its own, uninvited. By the beginning of the 7th month, the Alliance of the Grey River had formed around the cliff. 5 tribes, 400 people, 120 warriors. Not an army, but no longer a handful. Ash fell from the sky at the beginning of the 8th month. Not literally, but almost. A sentry in the southern tower saw a flash beyond the forest at night. Bright, white, like the one that left a scorched patch on the hill the day Dan showed up. In the morning, Dan went there, alone. Thorn didn't want to let him go. Brock wanted to go with him. Dan shook his head. If it was what he thought it was, he needed to be there first. He found her after a 2-hour walk. A clearing in the woods, a scorched circle, ash that was already scattering, and a woman, slender, short, light hair, a compass tattoo on her wrist, a dirty face, torn clothes, an ice axe in her hand. She stood in the center of the scorched circle and looked around, like a cornered animal. Dan stepped out from behind the trees. She saw him. a man in furs, with a bronze knife on his belt. She raised the ice axe, took a swing. Dan raised his hands and said in English, "Stop. MIT, Civil Engineering, 2017. She froze. The ice axe hung in the air. Her eyes went wide. She lowered her weapon and said, "Stanford, Glaciology, 2019. What am I doing here?" Dan exhaled. English. Real, living English. For the first time in 8 months. His voice broke on the second sentence. He wanted to say something clever, something calm and engineering-like. Instead, he said, "You have no idea how glad I am to see you." Her name was Ashley Carter. Ash, 28 years old, a glaciologist from Stanford. The last thing she remembered was a field camp in Antarctica, a blizzard, the crack of ice, then a flash, then 2 moons. Dan told her the story on the way to the settlement. Everything. 8 months in a 3-hour walk. Horn, echo, tribe, walls, bronze, groth, war. Ash listened and didn't interrupt. Her face changed every minute. Disbelief, shock, calculation, shock again. When they climbed the cliff and she saw the village, she stopped. She stood at the gates of Kira and looked. Stone walls, houses, a smithy, children with birch bark tablets, running water, pots, people in double-stitched fur clothing. She turned to Dan and said, "You built this in 8 months." Dan shook his head. "We built it." Ash adapted quickly, faster than Dan had expected. She was a scientist, a field scientist, accustomed to camps on the ice without electricity or hot water. A tent in Antarctica and a stone house on a cliff weren't as different as one might think. For the first week, she walked around the neighborhood. She looked at the river, at the cliffs, at the sky, at the blue moon. She jotted things down in a notebook that, by some miracle, was in her jacket pocket. A pencil, paper, real paper. Dan looked at the notebook as if it were a sacred relic. A week later, Ash came to him in the evening. She sat by the hearth and said, "I have 3 questions. First, why are there pterosaurs and mammoths here at the same time? Second, that blue moon is too bright for its size and distance. Something's wrong with it. Third, do you feel that humming in the ground, or am I going crazy?" Dan replied, "The first one, I don't know. The second, I agree. The third is echo. You're not going crazy." Then he told her about echo, about the glow, about the ability to sense materials, about the rule that he can't work alone. Ash listened. Then she said something that made Dan freeze. She said the hum got louder when she looked at rocks, as if the stone were speaking. She could see the layers, the composition, the age, not with her eyes, inside, like a sensation. Dan understood. Echo had given her the same gift it had given him. Not construction, geology. Her specialty, her knowledge, amplified and transformed into something greater. A glaciologist who senses the age of stone, who sees underground strata, who can find ore and water and voids in the rock just by placing a hand on the ground. Dan said, "Welcome to the team." Ash replied with a sigh that the tribe wouldn't understand. But Dan laughed. For the first time in 8 months, he laughed for real. She swore. A lot. Loudly, as usual. The tribe watched her warily. A fair-haired woman who made strange, sharp sounds and waved her arms. Ima approached Ash on the first day and looked her in the eyes. For a long time. Then she placed her hand on her chest, just like she did with Dan, and said one word. The same. Ash also carried Echo. Ash became an explorer. Dan gave her a map, a birch bark one, rough, on which the surroundings of the settlement within a day's walk were marked. Ash took it and said it wasn't a map, but a disgrace. Then she left for 3 days with 2 warriors assigned by Thorn, and returned with a map that had contour lines. Elevations, rivers, streams, rock types, ore deposits, water sources, caves, everything within a 20-kilometer radius, drawn in her notebook with a pencil, with a precision that made Dan freeze. Ash was a field scientist. She knew how to map. And now, with her heightened sense of the rock, she was it better than any geologist with instruments. On Ash's map, Dan saw 3 things. Iron ore, deposits west of the cliff, shallow, accessible. Limestone, to the south, for mortar and eventually for cement. And a cave, deep, to the northeast. Ash marked it with a special symbol. Next to it, she wrote a single word, anomaly. Dan asked, "What kind of anomaly?" Ash said. "I put my hand on the rock at the entrance, and the rock didn't speak. It was screaming. There's something down there, something old, very old, and it's made of a metal I don't know." Dan remembered Ima's words, black walls and deep caves, walls not made by humans. He said to Ash, "Later, first the war, then the cave." Ash nodded. She didn't argue with priorities. She was a scientist, but she was a pragmatist. 300 cannibals were more important than an underground anomaly. Iron ore changed the calculations. Bronze was good. Iron was better, harder, stronger, more accessible. Dan knew how to smelt iron. The melting point was 1,538 degrees, higher than bronze's. He needed a better furnace, bigger, with forced airflow through double bellows, with clay walls that could withstand the heat. He built it in a week, with Brock and the 4 blacksmiths he'd trained over the past few months. The first iron smelting. Brown stone in the furnace, a white flame. The bellows swing rhythmically. The heat is so intense that 2 steps away from the furnace, the air burns the skin. And it flows out of the furnace. Not red like copper. Gray, heavy, thick. Iron. The ingot cooled and Dan lifted it. Heavy, hard. He struck it with a stone. The sound is dull, not ringing like bronze. Heavy, solid, iron. Brock forged the first iron knife the next day. It took longer than the bronze one. It was harder to work with. Iron is more stubborn. But when the knife was ready and sharpened, Brock tested it on a log. The bronze knife left a notch. The iron one split it. Brock looked at Dan, and Dan saw in his eyes something he saw less and less often. Surprise. Brock was used to miracles, but even he was surprised by the iron. By the end of the 8th month, the settlement had 20 iron spearheads, 10 iron knives, and the first iron axe. The axe cut through wood like butter. Dan looked at the arsenal and counted. 20 archers, 30 spearmen, 2 catapults, traps on the trail, iron weapons, stone walls. Against 300, maybe more. Maybe it won't be enough, but that's all he has. A messenger arrived at dawn on the 9th month. A boy from an allied tribe in the north, barefoot, gasping for breath, with terror in his eyes. Grok had crossed the Great River. A 3-day journey, maybe 2. He's coming this way. Dan stood on the wall and looked north. Forest. Hills. Somewhere beyond them, 300 warriors with spears and skulls on poles, led by a cannibal shaman. Led by Coast, the traitor who knows every stone in the wall, every bend in the path, every weakness. Their me no longer existed. Dan gathered a council. Thorn, Brock, Ima, Kira, Ash. Lena, with her birch bark tablet. The chiefs of the allied tribes. Everyone. Dan spoke. Slowly. Clearly. In the language he had studied for 9 months and which finally obeyed him. He laid out the plan. They would not wait outside the walls. Waiting meant defeat. 300 against 50 defenders of the cliff was a siege. They would not survive a siege. They had no supplies to last months. Graka did. He would sit below and wait until they started eating rats. They needed something else. They needed to force Grok to attack, quickly, in one strike, along the trail, where traps and catapults and archers on the walls awaited. To force 300 men to climb the narrow trail where only 3 could walk in a row, and die. How to do it? Dan pointed to the birch bark, the settlement below, at the foot of the cliff. A decoy camp, huts, campfires, smoke, the appearance of life. Grok will see it and think there are people down there, defenseless. He'll attack the camp. The camp is empty. The people are on the cliff. Gro will see the deception. He'll get angry, and he'll send his men onto the path. Because Gro doesn't know how to retreat, his strength lies in fear. If he retreats before a stone wall, his people will stop being afraid. He'll attack, and the trail will become a trap. Thorn listened. He nodded. Brock listened. His eyes burned. Kira listened and studied the map. Ash listened and thought. Then she said in English, "What if he doesn't go up the trail? What if he goes around it?" Dan replied. "He can't go around it. 3 sides are cliffs. The only way up is the trail." "Or a siege," Ash said. "He could just lay siege." Dan nodded. He could. "That's why we need a second element." He pointed to the map for Ash. "The forest east of the cliff. Dense, with ravines. Brock and 20 archers. An ambush. When Gro throws his men onto the trail and gets bogged down, when the catapults and archers on the walls start firing, Brock will strike from behind, from the forest, with arrows, and then retreat. Not a battle. Bites. 1, 2, 3. Every bite is 10 arrows in the back. Every bite is panic. An enemy attacked from the front and the back cannot think. He can only die or run." Brock stood up. His face was calm. He understood the plan. He understood his role. 20 of his best archers, fast, silent, with iron tips. Bite and run, until the enemy breaks. Thorn stood up. He pounded his chest with his fist. The decision was made. 3 days of preparation. 3 days during which Dan didn't sleep at all. A decoy camp below. 20 huts made of branches. Bonfires that could be lit from a distance with an arrow tipped with burning tow. Skins on poles mimicking people. From a distance, it looked like a camp. Up close, the deception was obvious. But Grok would see it from afar. The trail. Dan checked every trap, every pit, every stake, every suspended log, every rock on the edge of the cliff. Everything was working. Everything was waiting. Catapults. Dan had sighted in both. The first hit the lower part of the trail, the second, the middle. Their ranges overlapped. The dead zone between them was 15 paces wide. 15 paces where the enemy could walk without risk of getting hit by a rock. Dan had filled that zone with additional pits, walls. Kira checked every stone, every joint, every ledge. She found 3 weak spots and reinforced them in a day. Dan watched her and thought that without her, the walls would be worse, much worse. Medicine. Ima had set up a field hospital, inside the walls, in the most secure corner. Clean bandages, boiled water, bitter leaves, splints for fractures. She trained 3 women to help her, not doctors, orderlies, but their hands were clean and they knew what to do with a bleeding wound. Ash took charge of surveillance. She climbed to the highest point of the cliff, a rocky outcrop above the eastern wall. From there, she could see 20 kilometers. She would be their eyes. 1 smoke signal meant they were coming. 2 smoke signals meant they were attacking. 3 smoke signals meant they were flanking. Lena sat in the hospital with birch bark tablets. She wrote everything down. The names of the wounded, the types of wounds, the treatment, the supplies. She didn't know how to treat them, but she knew how to count and remember, and that was no less important. Marin arrived at night, the day before the battle. Dan didn't know her, a dark-skinned woman with ritual scars on her face and a necklace of small bones around her neck. She appeared at the gate alone, with a knife. The sentry raised the alarm. Brock was at the gate in a minute. Marin dropped the knife to the ground. She raised her empty hands. and she spoke to the chieftain in a language that Thorn could barely understand, because it was a northern dialect. She said she knew everything about Graka. She would tell them everything. Then they could kill her. Thorn didn't kill her. He brought her to Dan. Maren sat by the fire and told her story. Ima translated. Lena took notes. Maren had been a blood priestess in Grok's tribe for 10 years. She had made sacrifices to his god. She slit throats. She ate the flesh of the slain. She did it because Grok would have killed her if she refused. And then he ordered her to sacrifice her younger brother, a 12-year-old boy. And she did it, because if she hadn't, Grok would have killed them both and eaten them. After that, she ran. She walked south for 3 weeks. She ate roots and drank from streams. And she came here to tell everything and die, because living after what she had done was impossible. Dan listened. His hands clenched his knees so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't imagine it. He didn't want to, but he listened, because her words contained information that would save lives. Maren told him about Grok, his tactics, his habits, his weaknesses. Grok always attacked at dawn, always in the center, always personally leading the first wave, because his men would follow him only as long as they could see his back ahead of them. He was brave, insanely brave, and that was his weakness. Because if the first wave faltered and Grok was wounded or killed, the rest would flee. They weren't an army. They were a mob united by fear of a single man. Kill the fear, and the mob will scatter. Dan listened, and the plan in his head shifted. It adjusted. It became more precise. He turned to Maren and said through Ima, "You won't die." Maren looked at him. There was no hope in her eyes, only emptiness. Dan said, "You'll tell me everything, then you'll live. Because the dead can't fix what they've done, only the living can." Maren was silent. Then she lowered her head, and a single tear fell from her eyes, the first in 10 years. They came at dawn, just as Maren had said. Ash lit the first smoke signal on a rocky outcrop. Dan stood on the wall and watched. The forest to north was stirring. People were emerging from under the trees. Dozens, hundreds. Dan counted and stopped at 200. Many, so many, more than 300. Grow had gathered more men along the way. They filled the valley beneath the cliff. Painted faces, spears, clubs, shields made of hides on wooden frames. A row of skulls hung from a long pole in the center of the formation. They saw the false camp, huts, smoke from smoldering fires, hides on the gloss. From a distance of 200 paces, it looked like a camp, a living camp. Grok gave the order. The warriors rushed forward, quickly, with a howl. They stormed into the camp and hacked at the huts and the poles with the hides. Empty. Everything was empty. The howling stopped. Silence. 400 warriors stood amid the ruins of the empty huts and looked at the cliff, at the stone walls, at the people behind them. Grok stepped forward. Dan saw him for the first time. Huge, a head taller than any of his warriors, as broad as 2 men. A necklace of human jaws around his neck. A helmet made from the skull of a saber-toothed cat on his head. In his hand, a club with a stone pommel the size of a child's head. He stood before the cliff and looked up, at the walls, at Dan. Their eyes met across 200 paces of emptiness. Grok screamed, a long, hoarse howl, a challenge, a command, a promise. Dan didn't move. Grok raised his club and pointed to the trail. His warriors moved forward. The first wave, 50 men, Grok in the lead. Just as Maren had said, in person, at the very front. They began climbing the trail. The path zigzagged, the first turn, the second. At the third turn, the first warrior stepped into a trap. His foot gave way. A spike pierced his soul. A scream. The warrior fell. The next one stepped over him and fell into the second pit. Another scream. The path was narrow. 3 men in a row. The fallen blocked the way. Those behind were pushing forward. Those in front were stumbling over the wounded. Gro didn't stop. He stepped over his own men. He kept moving forward. The fourth turn. Dan gave the signal. The first catapult fired. A stone the size of a man's head flew over the path and crashed into the slope next to the formation. Dirt and debris. Second volley. More accurate. The stone hit a group of 5 warriors at the second turn. Dan didn't see what happened. He only saw the formation break apart at that spot, how the men tumbled down the slope. The second catapult fired at the upper part of the trail. The stone flew over Groka's head. He didn't even duck. He kept moving forward. Dan gave the order to the archers. 10 men on the wall. A volley. Arrows flew down the trail. Iron tips. 70 paces away. 3 warriors fell. Another volley. 2 more. The path was turning into a bloodbath. The wounded were screaming. The dead lay on the rocks. The living were climbing over them. And Grok kept walking. He had covered half the path. His warriors were falling all around him. Pits, rocks, arrows. But he kept walking. And as long as he walked, the rest followed him. Dan gave the signal. A log, suspended by a vine at the 6th bend. A warrior on the wall cut the vine. The log rolled across the path. Heavy, wet with morning dew. It knocked down 6 men, threw them off the path and down, a 5-meter fall onto the rocks. Grok dodged it. He leaped back toward the cliff. He pressed his back against it. The log rolled past. He got up and kept going. Dan watched him and felt something he hadn't expected. Respect. A mad, blind respect for a man who walked through death without stopping. Grok was a monster, a cannibal, a killer, but he wasn't a coward. The second wave began to rise, another 100. The path was jam-packed. The living were climbing over the dead. The catapults fired. The archers shot, but there were too many of them. Grok had covered 3/4 of the path. 40 paces remained to the gate. Dan exhaled and lit his second smoke signal, a signal to Brok, a strike from the rear. The forest east of the cliff erupted with arrows. Brok's 20 archers struck the rear ranks of the horde, those waiting below for their turn to climb. Arrows from the forest, out of nowhere, without warning. Panic. The rear ranks turned, ran away from the forest, collided with those climbing the trail. Chaos. A stampede. People were falling off the trail, pushing each other. Dan saw his chance. The formation had broken. The link between Grok on the trail and his horde below had been severed. Grok was alone. With 20 warriors at the top of the trail, the rest were fleeing or crushing each other below. Dan gave the order. All catapults on the lower trail. Cut Grok off from reinforcements. Stones flew. The trail between the 4th and 5th terms turned into a wall of dust and debris. No one could pass. Gro remained at the top with 20 men, facing the wall, facing the gates of Kira, facing 10 archers shooting down from the platform. 20 became 15, then 10. The arrows struck point blank. It was impossible to miss from 30 paces. Gro stood. 3 arrows stuck out of his shield, 1 from his shoulder. Blood ran down his arm. He didn't fall. He looked up at Dan, and in his eyes, Dan saw not anger, a question. How? How did you do that? 4 remained around Grok, then 2. Then he was alone, standing on the path 30 paces from the gate, with a club in his hand, with an arrow in his shoulder, with blood on his face. Alone. Dan shouted, "Stop!" The archers froze. Silence. Only the groans of the wounded below, and the wind. Dan looked at Grok. Grok looked at Dan. Dan spoke in the language he'd been learning for 9 months. Slowly, so Grok would understand. You built men. I built walls. You're dead. Mine stand. Grok was silent. Blood dripped from his hand. Then he spoke in a hoarse, broken voice. He said that walls crumble. They always crumble. People don't, Dan replied. Your people lie on this path, and mine stand on these walls, and walls don't crumble if those who built them built for the living. Grow was silent. Then he dropped his club. It struck a rock and rolled down the path. He stood unarmed, with an arrow in his shoulder, and looked at Dan. Dan walked down to the gate. He opened it. He stepped out onto the path, alone. Brock hissed behind him. Thorn shouted. Dan didn't stop. He walked up to Grow. He stood before him. Grow was a head taller, twice as broad, with hands that snapped necks. Dan raised his empty hands. He gestured. Nothing. Then he gestured down, at the trail, at the dead and wounded. Then he gestured at the wall, at the living. Then he said, "Enough." Grow looked down at him, for a second, 10, 30. Then his knees buckled, not from the wound, from something that snapped inside. He sank onto the stones of the trail, sat down, and closed his eyes. The battle for the Grey River Fortress was over. It rained for 3 days after the battle, washing the blood from the path, carrying it into the river. Dan stood on the wall and watched as the water did the work he couldn't bring himself to do, clearing away the bodies. Others took care of that. Brock organized it. The dead enemies were buried in a mass grave at the foot of the cliff. The wounded were brought up to Ima's hospital. 47 people. Enemies. People who, an hour ago, had been climbing the trail to kill and eat. Now they lay in the stone building, and Ima was washing their wounds with boiled water and applying bandages made of clean leather. Thorn didn't understand. Why treat the enemies? Dan explained. These people weren't Grok warriors by choice. Marin told him. Half the horde consists of tribes that Grok has absorbed, people who were forced into it. Heal them, feed them, show them that life can be different, and they'll stay, not as prisoners, as people. Thorn had his doubts. Brock had his doubts. Gort spat and grumbled. But Ima had no doubts. She healed. Silently. Everyone. No matter which side of the trail he had fought on. Because a wound is a wound, and pain is pain. Grok sat in a separate house, under guard. Ima pulled the arrow from his shoulder. She washed the wound and bandaged it. Grok didn't resist. He didn't speak. He sat and stared at the wall. Dan came to see him on the second day, sat across from him, was silent for a long time, then asked through Ima, who translated, "Why? Why the purge? Why the killings? Why the cannibalism?" Grok was silent. Then he spoke, quietly, not like a chief, like a man whom no one had listened to for far too long. He told his story. When he was 10, his tribe was slaughtered. Everyone. His mother, his father, his brothers. Their neighbors slaughtered them over hunting grounds. He survived because he hid in a pit with the corpses. 3 days, without water, without food. He ate the dead, his own dead, because he wanted to live. And when he crawled out of the pit, he was a different man. He decided that the world was simple. The strong eat the weak, literally. And if he became the strongest, no one would eat him. Never again. Dan listened. His hands clenched his knees. He couldn't justify Grok. Hundreds of dead, children eaten, tribes destroyed. Nothing justifies that. But he could understand. A boy in a pit of corpses, 10 years old, 3 days in hell, and then 40 years of madness built on a single idea. Eat so as not to be eaten. Dan said, "You were wrong. The world doesn't work that way. The strong aren't those who eat. The strong are those who feed." Grok looked at him. In his eyes was something like weariness, a deep, long-standing weariness. He said, "Prove it." Dan nodded. He would prove it. Not with words, with deeds. just as he had proven everything in this world, with stone and clay, with fire and water, with hands that build, not kill. 2 weeks after the battle, the wounded were recovering. Of the 47, 41 survived. 6 died. Ima wept for each one, even for the enemies, especially for the enemies, because they died from wounds she couldn't heal, and that was her personal defeat. Dan hugged her and said, 41. You saved 41. Ima shook her head, but she wiped away her tears. The surviving Graka warriors faced a choice, to leave or to stay. Dan didn't hold them back. 23 left, back north, to their tribes. 18 stayed. They saw the walls. They saw the pots. They saw children who didn't cough. They saw food in abundance, and they decided it was better here. The Union's population had surpassed 500. 500 people, 20 tribes, 3 days' journey from the cliff to the distant settlements, but all were connected, by trade, by knowledge, bronze and iron, soap and boiled water. Dan looked at Ash's map and saw not dots on birch bark. He saw the beginnings of a country. The settlement was growing. Dan stopped thinking of it as a settlement. It was a city. Tiny, primitive, but a city. 150 people lived on the cliff permanently. 30 houses, 3 smithies, 2 pottery workshops, a school with a roof designed by Kira, a library, a single shelf of birch bark scrolls in which Lena recorded everything. Recipes, blueprints, names, stories. The first story of Orna written by human hand. The wheel, the plow, iron, soap, glass. Dan began making glass at the end of the 10th month. Sand and lye at a very high temperature. The first pieces were cloudy, crooked, useless. But by the 5th attempt, he had a clear piece the size of a palm. He polished it, for a long time, carefully, with a stone and water, until the surface became smooth and convex, a lens. He brought it to Ime. The old shamaness took it, turned it over, looked through it, and froze. Her eyes, 64 years old, cataracts were setting in. She could no longer see. The small text on birch bark was no longer visible to her. She held the needle in her hands by touch. But through Dan's lens, she could see. Clearly, sharply, every little line, every letter. Ima stood with the lens to her eyes and looked at the world, which had become sharp again. She didn't cry. She laughed, quietly, like a child. Dan stood beside her and smiled. A trifle, a piece of glass. But for her, it was the world, a world restored. Sora. Dan found her 11 months after the transfer. Ash discovered a cave on the coast, a 4-day walk to the Meta. A cave with drawings on the walls, not primitive drawings, frescoes, detailed, beautiful. People, mountains, the moon, trees. A style Dan recognized immediately. Korean, classical Korean painting. Fine lines, empty space as an element of composition, harmony. He entered the cave and saw a woman, petite, with long black hair down to her waist. Sitting in front of the wall and drawing with a burnt stick, he spoke in Korean, words his grandmother had taught him as a child. "Hello!" The woman turned around, her face, young but with eyes that held 50 years of loneliness. She looked at him and her lips moved. She tried to speak. And couldn't. She hadn't spoken aloud in 50 years. Dan sat down next to her. He spoke, in Korean, quietly, slowly, about himself, about engineering, about Seattle, about his father from Busan, about his grandmother who made kimchi and sang lullabies in Korean. Sora listened. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away. An hour later, she spoke her first word in 50 years. Home. Dan took her to the village. She followed him like a shadow, never letting go of his hand. A 4-day journey. She held his hand and wouldn't let go, and Dan wouldn't let go either, because he knew what loneliness was. 8 months without his native language, 50 years without a human voice. He couldn't imagine it, didn't want to. In the village, he gave her a home. He gave her food. He gave her warmth. And a week later, when she really started to speak, he gave her paper. Not birch bark, paper. Real paper. He had boiled it down from bark and fibers for 3 days. Thin, white, smooth. And a brush made of bristles. And ink made of soot and resin. Sora took the brush, dipped it in the ink, and painted. 12 hours without stopping. Dan didn't go in to see her. No one went in. In the morning, she came out, and in her hands were 10 sheets. On them was a story. Her story. 50 years on a foreign planet, painted so that Dan could see every day, every night, every tear, and every dawn. Sora was an artist, a court artist of the Joseon dynasty, transported to Orn half a century before Dan, alone, waiting, and now having found it. A year, 1 year since the transport. Dan stood on the fortress tower, the one designed by Kira, the highest point. Everyone was with him. Ima, Kira, Sora, Lena, Ash, Marin, Brock, Thorn. From the tower, everything is visible. The 20 settlements of the Grey River Union, the smoke from the forges, the green fields, roads, the first real roads, the river below, the forest, the mountains, and the blue moon on the horizon, huge, bright. Ash stood next to him and looked at the moon. Then she said quietly, "Dan, I studied its spectrograms through the glass you made." Dan looked at her. Ash said, "It's artificial." Dan was silent for a long time. The wind blew from the north, cold, autumnal. Then he said, "I know. I figured it out too." Ima came up behind him, small, up to his chest. She put her hand on his back and whispered, in a language Dan now understood completely. "The echo is speaking to me tonight," it says. "Now look up. They'll wake up soon." Dan stood on the tower. Around him stood the people he loved. Below lay the world that he had built over the years, stone by stone, pot by pot, child by child. He hadn't built a city. He had built hope. And now hope was looking up, at the blue moon, which slowly, barely perceptibly, was opening its eyes. Sora stood next to a sheet of paper and a paintbrush. She was drawing. The moon. An eye. Stars. The first page of a new story. Lena was writing. Quietly. Quickly. Every word. Every name. Every moment. So that those who come after would know. That people lived here. That they built. That they did not give up. Kira stood at the edge of the tower and looked at her gate. At every stone she had laid. And for the first time in her entire life, she knew she wasn't a commodity, not a pawn, not a gift. She was a builder, and this was her city. Marin stood slightly to the side, alone, as always, with a necklace made of her brother's bones around her neck. But her eyes were different, not empty. Tomorrow she would go to school. Lena had asked her to help with the children. Dan had asked. Because to the most broken man, he had entrusted what was most precious, and Marin said yes. Brock stood behind Dan, with a bow, as always. He wasn't looking at the moon. He was looking at the forest, at the roads, at the horizon, watching over them, as always, because someone has to look down while the rest look up. Dan closed his eyes. The wind, the smell of smoke from the forges, the scent of fresh birch bark from the library, a child's distant laughter, the clang of a hammer on an anvil, the creak of a wheel, the murmur of water in a stone channel, the sounds of the world he had built for the people whose names he knew. He opened his eyes. The blue moon was looking down at him, and Dan looked back. He didn't know what was up there. He didn't know what would wake him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing. Whatever came, he would meet it standing, on the walls built by his people, in the city built by his love, with hands that don't know how to kill, only to build, only to repair, only to create. His father used to say, "If you walk into a room and something is broken, you fix it." Dan walked into the world, and the world was broken. And he fixed it. Every day, stone by stone. And he will keep fixing it, as long as his hands can hold.